This is The Last Human, written by Isaac Young, narrated by Son of Sonnet. Chapter 1. The Stranger. I was 14 when Amon Russ came to collect his bounty from the maggot farms of Giza 6. He had traveled all the way to the outer edges of the Druscarus sector, to Mansa space. Until then, I had never seen another human being before. I thought I was the last one left. At least, that's as close as I can put it. Back then, I didn't have an understanding of what a human was. All that I understood was that I was different from my fellow Mansa laborers. I looked different, ugly even. I was weaker, barely able to breathe the thick plumes of hydrogen sulfide in the agrofields. I was dumber. I couldn't speak the Mansa language, and so my Ptah, my supervisor, was forced to resort to Galactic Basic. And of that simplest language, I could only glean very little. So, when Amon took off his ventilator mask, I wasn't sure what kind of species I was looking at. It took me a moment to realize his bizarre features were similar to my own, at least like my hazy, yellowish reflection in the coolant sludge. He pointed at me and spoke a language I didn't understand. When I shook my head in confusion, he switched to a version of Galactic Basic that was equally foreign to me. It was only much later that I learned he had been asking for my name. Names are not an alien concept on Giza 6, but to apply it in the sense of an individual was. The problem was that he had addressed the question in the singular, referring to me and me alone. If you were asked for your identity, you would have answered in your clade, which defined your role in the Mansa hierarchy. And if you were especially important, you would have been given a designation number. Otherwise, identity markers were reserved for when you were on shifts, when it was necessary to track productivity. If I technically understood the question, I would have answered Xeno Urtaf of subsection 703 third cycle shift number 536289. And if I properly understood the question, I would have answered Voss. But back then, I didn't realize the word you called yourself could be used by others as well. All I knew then was that a stranger with my face had appeared. I wondered if there were others like him, and I wondered if I could go there. It was not out of courage that I aided the bounty hunter. As far as I was concerned, I was just trying to survive. The workers were processing on the loading dock, boarding the floating skiffs to set out over the wriggling agrofields. I had just strapped into my seat, crammed in with a dozen other Mansa near the back. We sat in 2 rows, facing each other while the pilot in the fore compartment was chittering at the controls. The harnesses and the seat were uncomfortable. They were not designed for a human body. My legs could not reach the grated flooring, swinging in the open air. The harness was also too big. Instead of resting snugly against my chest, I had to sling it around my stomach to keep myself secured to the skiff. Much of the vessel was left with the dangerous unconcern of its occupants. And since Mansa do not sit so much as lean back and rest on their jointed legs, I was always in fear of sliding off the seating and tumbling into the fields 100 feet below. That day, I heard sounds of distress above the usual chattering. Not many can parse out the inflections and tone of the Mansa language, but even a novice could have detected the frenzied higher pitch from the loading dock. The skiff swayed in the air as a new pair of boots jumped onto the deck. The alien was scaly and orange and wore a tattered jumpsuit. It had bulging eyes and a powerful set of snapping jaws. Around its neck were a set of frills that seemed to flutter with every breath the creature took. Its 4-fingered hands held something. It looked behind and barked a sound which I took to be a cry of anger. Before I had time to get the measure of this new visitor, the alien ran to the front of the skiff and shot the Mansa pilot in the head. The insect slumped off his seat, spilling dark purple blood all over the console. The orange alien pushed the controls forward, and the skiff's engines screeched as the vessel jerked forward. It had still been tethered to the loading dock, and so the clamping mechanism was ripped off, sending the skiff spinning dizzyingly in the air. The Mansa around me were chittering, distressed, but not one of them unbuckled themselves to try to wrest back control of the skiff. They were Urtaf. They were not expected to fight. We were rising steadily away from the loading dock. Despite the alien's poor grasp of the piloting controls, it had managed to stabilize the vessel and swing it clumsily forward. I had just unbuckled myself and stumbled to my feet when I saw another alien run forward onto the loading dock below. It was wearing a full Evo suit, and so I couldn't see any of its features behind the bulbous black visor. It raised its pistol and took several pot shots at us. I ducked for cover, and even though it would have broken my legs, I looked to jump off the rising ship. Broken bones were better than dead. However, I was forced to take cover as bullets ricocheted off the metal, and one or two of the Mansa workers caught a stray round. Their chittering turned to gasping cries of pain. One was dead, sagging in its harness. The alien below ran to another skiff, and that was the last I saw of him as my hijacker pushed our vessel up and away. The loading dock was growing smaller. The bustling piers turned to many small metal fingers arrayed on the side of one of the hexagonal arcologies that were strewn across the titanic caverns of under Hive 204. I was panicking. We were going in the wrong direction. The alien should have angled the skiff down and towards the aggrefields. Access to the surface was only through the freight elevators which carried heavy loads up and down the hives. As we picked up speed, I realized the orange alien could accidentally crash the skiff into one of the massive supports which held up the rocky sky. Stumbling over to the cockpit, I shouted in my poor understanding of basic, "Stop! Stop!" The scaly alien turned in surprise, and I found myself having a pistol aimed squarely at my head. The creature seemed dumbfounded. I did not know why, but my presence caused it to forget for a moment that it was flying us up into a tangled maze of metal and ovoid lights. I shouted again, and it seemed to snap out of its confusion. The alien started angling the vessel downward, seeing the danger. We didn't have time to converse further as more gunshots plinked off our ship. The scaly alien suddenly grabbed me and thrust me towards the controls, growling an order I didn't understand. But I didn't need to. It was obvious what he wanted. The other alien, the one in the Evo suit, had pulled a skiff alongside ours. With one hand, he was piloting his vessel while firing at us. I tried to hide behind the pilot's seat as cover. There wasn't much in the way of protection, as all the steering section had to shield was a safety rail. I later learned Amon Russ could have easily shot me from my position if he wanted to, but he didn't, and he himself had been left shocked at my presence. The scaly alien had taken cover near the back, using the still harnessed Mansa as body shields. The two exchanged fire as I clumsily aimed the skiff low towards the wriggling expanse of the aggrefields. Black, nutrient-rich sludge was pumped into irrigation trenches that lined the maggot farms. The white maggots, many as big as my leg, were teeming in their soil beds. Workers harvested the ripe fields, placing the maggots into liquidizer canisters which were then poured into tanks on the sides of the skiffs. The maggot fluid was then taken to a distribution center where it was shipped as nutrient paste all over the underhives. We flew past thousands of workers who paused and gawked, annoyed at our unusual flight. We passed over churning pump stations and smoking auto-harvesters. We passed plastic gazebos growing specialized maggot subspecies. The long iron gangways and concrete path were a blur as we raced across the flattened landscape. I desperately wanted to slow down and jump off, but I was only slightly more familiar with the controls than the alien. I had seen the worker Mansa operate them all my life, and so I vaguely knew which switches on the pronged panels did what. But operating them was a whole other matter. For whatever reason, maybe it was my panic, maybe it was my inexperience, I simply couldn't slow the skiff down. I glanced back at the scaly alien who had now been hit in the arm. The creature's strange green blood was soaking through its jumpsuit as it continued firing. Seeing as it was distracted by its opponent, whoever he was, I made a snap decision. Wanting to get as far away from this firefight as I could, I angled the skiff towards an empty stretch of the aggrefields. The alien saw what I was doing and pointed its pistol at me, but before it could bark out another unintelligible word, our ship hit the maggot beds. I lost control of the vessel as we crashed through soil, sludge, and white maggots. The engines below the skiff sheared off and the fluid tanks ruptured. The Mansa, who were still alive in the back, shrieked louder as the scaly alien wildly popped off a few more shots in the air. After that, all I remember was being violently thrown from the skiff. I landed on my side and gasped in pain as I skidded and rolled and then finally came to a stop on the bank of the irrigation canal. The pungent air made it difficult to breathe, yet my eyes teared up from the noxious fumes. I coughed, and I wiped away a crushed maggot from my face. As sense came back to me, I recall looking up and seeing the burning wreckage of the skiff. The few Mansa left alive inside were picking themselves out of the debris and going to work gathering maggots and liquidizers. It was all they could do while they awaited further instruction. The scaly alien was further up on the soil bed. Its left leg had been ripped off in the collision, and it was roaring uselessly in pain to the deaf auditory slits of the Mansa. It wasn't that they wouldn't willingly give help, but it wasn't their function to assist alien life forms, and so they didn't. Neither did they assist me. The other skiff landed nearby, and out came the other alien in the Evo suit. The scaly one barked in panic and tried to crawl away, but the thing in the Evo suit put a heavy boot in the creature's chest. He pulled something from his belt, a small spiny device with many hooks running along its side. The Evo suit alien pushed a button, and then those hooks became alive with skin-crawling movement. He dropped it onto the scaly one's neck, and the device buried itself into the creature. The screams of pain and rage suddenly ceased, and the scaly alien fell limp in the maggot soil. I did not know whether it was alive or dead. More than anything, I wanted to run away. My heart was pounding in my chest, but my body refused to move. I was fighting for every breath, and I was stuck. The muggy soil near the irrigation canal gave way underneath me. It clung to me and was pulling me down. The maggots were swarming, their heavy bodies pushing me down into the black sludge where even more were feeding. Their circular mouths bit on my skin, not yet breaking through. Down and down, I was dragged towards the black river where I would drown and decompose for the maggots' next meal. All I could do was let out a choked shout as I felt the warm sludge lap at my legs. I knew this was where I was going to die. The Mansa were indifferent towards their alien slaves. Most were less efficient, and so no great resource or effort were spent on them. The sludge was up to my waist, and the worms buried me in their white bodies. All I could see was quivering pale flesh. I couldn't breathe any longer. Their weight was too much on my chest. I opened my mouth in a silent cry for my mother as they pulled me under the black viscous fluid of the irrigation canal. Something took hold of my arm. With great effort, I was heaved upwards and back into the noxious air. A blurry figure carried me back towards higher ground where it was easier to breathe. I was on the edge of consciousness, but slowly, I came to my senses again. We were at the alien's skiff. He had set me sitting against the vessel. The alien in the Evo suit asked me a question I couldn't understand. And when he saw I couldn't respond, he took off his ventilator mask. I saw underneath was a strangely familiar species. He pointed at me and asked again. I didn't know the reason for his interest in me then. I didn't know that was the day I was leaving Giza 6 forever. The Skrikstaff battle fighters did not take long. 3 of the spindly, chitinous vessels appeared in the distance. Their silicate steel wings thumped in the air, and one could be forgiven for thinking the ships themselves were giant insects. Their cockpits were 2 bulging eyes of hex glass, and their landing struts were fashioned like many tiny legs. The body of the massive insect was serrated, with gaps for turrets and other weapons. However, their silver hulls finally gave them away as something decidedly machine. They were one of the few things cleaned and maintained on Giza 6. As I approached, the strange alien in the Evo suit, Amon Russ, tried to give me a small, less advanced rebreather. I refused him as alien workers such as myself were not permitted to use such devices. Eventually, he shoved it in my mouth, and upon my first gasp of clean air, I couldn't summon the will to spit it out. The Skrikstaff battle fighters reached us. 2 great lights clunked on and illuminated our position. They remained hovering, the ships circling us, while the 3rd landed a short distance away. The thorax of the battle fighter opened on the side, and a landing ramp extended down onto the agrafield. 2 Skrikstaff soldiers descended with a Pataf trailing behind. The Skrikstaff looked somewhat like worker Mansa, with the same mandible jaw and compound eyes. However, they're always a head and a half taller than their lesser brethren. Their jointed arms and legs have long chitinous blades extending out, which they can use just as efficiently as regular weapons. They possessed adorned armor, which was commemorated with sharp symbols that denoted rank. The Pataf, however, was completely different in every way. From a quick glance, one wouldn't think that they were even of the same species to the rest of the Mansa. They are held aloft by hover nodules connected by a plast-organic mesh. They had an appearance much like the maggots, Their bloated, pale flesh always threatened to spill out from underneath the small hover nodes. But unlike the maggots, they have beady black eyes, a trunk-like protrusion from their face, and 4 sets of mechanical arms grafted onto their bodies. I cowered near the skiff as Amon Russ marched out to meet them. The Skrikstaff began to raise their rifles, but the Ptaf waved one of its mechanical limbs. It spoke, and while I didn't understand the details of the conversation at the time, Amon Russ told me much later.
Senior entity number 3829.
A clicking voice hissed from a grafted implant near the throat of the Ptaf.
You departed from the residential districts and trespassed into a Mansa exclusive zone. You will provide restitution for the damages done, or else you will be detained as a Xeno-Urtaf until this voice of the Mansa is satisfied with your compensation.
I was acting fully in my rights as per pursuant of a Class 6 criminal. Freedom of movement and collateral damage are authorized under Dalphaean law.
Dalphaean law is not recognized here. This voice of the Mansa demands restitution.
The Ptaf wheezed. Your people are a protectorate under the Dalphaean ascendancy. You signed a treaty when your people surrendered to Dalphaean conquest. Do you want me to take this to the water courts? Amon threatened.
This voice of the Mansa will not permit you to make such charges.
The Skrikstaff tightened their grips on their rifles. There was a pause as Amon stared down the beady-eyed maggot face of the Ptaf. Finally, he sighed and clicked a few buttons on his arm screen. If the Ptaf was pleased by this, it made no recognizable gesture expressing it. Instead, it pointed its skeletal metal hand towards me and bid me forward. I had thrown away the rebreather before it could spot me with it. I weakly got to my feet and walked over to the Ptaf. I made to assume the submit position, lying forward with my face against the ground and my hands behind my back. However, Amon Russ firmly grabbed my shoulder and stopped me. No, you will not do that. That simple command was at least something I could understand. I glanced frightened and meekly towards the Ptaf for help. Its expression was inscrutable as always. I want this Xeno-Urtaf, Amon Russ said. Without a second's pause, the Ptaf answered.
This voice of the Mansa demands 3 hit units as payment.
No! I shouted in a sudden panic. As much as I was curious of the stranger's origins, I did not want to stop being an Urtaf. That would mean I could no longer go to the ration dispensary. I wouldn't be able to eat. I wouldn't be able to work. I wouldn't even be allowed in the underhive. This was absolutely unthinkable to me. This man was handing me a death sentence. I struggled against his grip. I wanted to go over to the liquidizer canisters and begin harvesting the maggots with the rest of the Mansa who survived the crash. But as much as I hit and flailed, Amon Russ wouldn't let me go. Please! Please! I shrieked at the Ptaf. Work! Work! I motioned desperately to the agrofields. The Ptaf didn't even acknowledge my existence. And so it was that Amon Russ threw me over his shoulder and carried me kicking and screaming to freedom. Chapter 2. Reminiscence. I fear history will not be kind to the Mansa. I know it will be upon their necks that the galaxy will hang the guilt of Vastu Kal. And when it's time for the uninformed, the charlatan, and the propagandist to write their great texts, I pray they will remember to take the word of the man himself. It's all too tempting to think that the Mansa were the ones who taught the tyrant his trade, but to say this is to misunderstand the Mansa. The Mansa never treated me cruelly, for they don't have a conception of malice. This is the most difficult thing to understand about the Mansa. Along with intellect, most species in the galaxy also bear the burden of consciousness they inherited from mankind. The Mansa thoroughly lack this. It is difficult to grasp a fully coherent and even emotional conversation with a creature who has no thought of its own. But that is how the Mansa are. They are individuals, but they aren't. They are emptied of themselves for the hive. They bear the resemblance of men without their sin, and the price of that was their freedom. The closest thing on Urtaf, or any Mansa, could come to malice was an intentional failure in their assigned duties. But even that was unthinkable to the insects. I recall one incident when an acid vat intended for euthanasia burst open and spilled onto the factory floor. The Mansa still continued, packaging their willing brethren in nutrient-rich foam even while they themselves were being dissolved away. I had long fled to the upper gangways, and it was only until the alarm had been triggered that the surviving Mansa processed out of the room. It wasn't that they didn't understand the danger or even comprehend the finality of their own deaths. It was just that the hive demanded they work, and so they did until told otherwise. At the time, I felt guilty for not dying down there with them. It was what was expected of me. And I ran, crying as an infant. For many decades, I thought I was a coward for doing so. And it is only with the hindsight of centuries that I realize it was courage. As I reflect, I have come to the conclusion that I was always a terrible Mansa, and for that, I am eternally grateful. Regardless, my life was not of abject misery under sadistic slavers. The Mansa don't have a concept of punishment. Their penalties for Xeno-Urtaf was restricting food rations. And for those Xeno who hoarded rations or harmed the Mansa, their only other penalty was death. It was a simplistic justice system, but one that worked quite well. There was a black market and criminals, of course. And there were always slaves who stepped outside of Mansa law. But that was always difficult when so much of Giza 6 couldn't be bought or coerced or even convinced to look the other way. They didn't have the wherewithal to do so. Crime was kept low, but so were all the other things that made life worth living. As for myself, I never interacted with the criminal world, though I knew on some level it existed. It is illegal for Xeno-Urtafs to converse with one another, and such slaves are a rare enough thing that the occurrence wouldn't usually happen anyway. It is upon that fact which I attribute my life. As a child, I would not have understood the severity of the crime. And as an adolescent, the care had departed from me. My only concern was meeting my work quota, which was never set too high. Since my biology was poorly adapted to their atmosphere, my expected working hours were never that long. Many slaves were in a similar position, little more than half-useless workers. It is a wonder that Mansa bother with alien labor, but I suppose it was just efficient enough to warrant the effort. It is strange to think that my life was spared on so simple a calculation, that the fate of the galaxy was changed on so simple an arithmetic, but that is the way of things. I worked, I ate, I slept. I spent my days wanting for nothing and wanting to do nothing. And when I was bored, I wandered the oily streets of Underhive 204, gawking at the many bulging and porous buildings. They were what you would expect from insects who learned industry. The upper levels were huge hexagonal arcologies crisscrossed with thousands of walkways and bridges. Below were the factories and agri-fields, and below them were the brackish coolant rivers. When I was really bored, I climbed all the way to the surface, which was little more than a barren desert populated with yet more industrial architecture. The sky was nearly always covered in a thick smog, but on some nights, on rare nights, could catch a glimpse of twinkling light. I once asked my pataf what those lights were. He said they were gaseous balls of fire. That answer has always been unsatisfying to me. I resolved there must have been more than that, and I did eventually discover that there was much more than that. I tell you this so that you will understand that it was not the Mansa who made Vastu call. I hope that whatever the galaxy comes to view of me, they will remember me as the man who just wanted to see the stars. The Mansa could only teach me obedience. Amon Russ taught me loyalty. The Mansa taught me poverty. Amon Russ taught me humility. The Mansa taught me resignation. Amon Russ taught me courage. And for all the rest, the galaxy was a good enough teacher. If there is any explanation, any blame you could lay at the Mansa's feet, it is only this. The Mansa taught me dispassion. And for that, I had always been prepared to set the galaxy aflame. And even then, it was Amon Russ who convinced me that the galaxy was worth saving. It was often hard to tell the difference between the surface and the underground. The yellow, smoggy sky snuffed out openness and freedom. Everything felt constricted and closed. You could only tell what was a few meters in front of you. The hulking buildings were too hazy and indistinct to serve as landmarks. And the labyrinthine roads and walkways only made the confusion worse. It made you feel lost. It made you want to crawl up in a hole somewhere because you could at least see everything in the hole. Amon Russ guided the skiff slowly, floating towards a destination only he knew. Strapped haphazardly to his seat was the scaly alien. The hooked device Amon had used was embedded deeply into its neck. 2 vents on its metal side wheezed as the alien breathed, still alive despite its lost leg. I later learned the device was a gruk neutralizer, a favorite among bounty hunters and others of less reputable professions. It implanted itself into the necks or chests of its victims. The device would then release sedatives to pacify the target as its monofilament wires hijacked the victim's nervous system. Once done, the standard setting was to render the target comatose for transport. But even if the alien did somehow wake up, there was precious little it could do. It would wake to a completely paralyzed body. Even its breathing and heartbeat was at Amon's mercy. But to be honest, I felt a little better off. Twice I had considered jumping off the skiff and trying to return to my habitation pod. But knowing my hesitance, Amon had waved another neutralizer in my face. Just the thought of it digging into my neck dissuaded all notions of running. I had seen how far he was willing to go for his bounty, and I knew I would not be able to put up a fight like the scaly alien. And even if I had escaped him, I knew I could never return to the Mansa, not unless I was sold back. So I quietly sat on the deck, looking out into those smoggy clouds and wondering what horrible future was awaiting me. And despite what you might think of my upbringing, my imagination was left thoroughly unimpaired. I had seen enough horrors on Giza 6 to have a few nasty ideas of what might happen. A shape did eventually emerge from the choking haze. What I thought was another of the massive jutting buildings resolved into a landing pad for a great ship. Its maw opened up like the jaws of a starving crocodile, the skin-draped beasts that wandered Giza 6 wastelands, and from its mouth poured all manner of antennae, broadcasters, and machines that I didn't know the names for. Atop its white and black hull, I saw its eyes were a slanted pane of orange hex glass. The beast looked uncomfortable sitting, its landing legs scrunched up like it was prepared to pounce. On its sides were 2 wings jutting downwards, actually long shield generators, and on its back was a mighty engine. It was huge, bigger than any flying ship I had ever seen. I cowered in its presence, even though the Aphelion was no larger than a standard cargo vessel. To me, it might have been a new world. I could have spent years crawling over every meter of the ship, and it would still have secrets not known to me. And this was truer than I could have guessed at the time. Amon Russ docked the skiff at the edge of the pad, which seemed all too small for the Aphelion. Along the ragged hull, a panel opened and a ramp lowered to the grimy platform. I saw an alien, one I didn't recognize, rush down from the massive ship and towards the skiff. Amon pointed to it and looked at me. "English. Bake." I stared at him, unblinking, not knowing what he was trying to tell me. The alien resolved into a clear shape. It wore a lustrous black cloth, a gown, that was pierced by many pins along its flat chest. It had fur, and its furrowed ears sat atop its head. It had a small snout, and it wore a scarlet headband around its eyes. And although I could not see its eyes, the creature moved as if it could see perfectly well anyway. It came to the skiff, and it spoke galactic basic that was too fast for me to follow. Amon and it had a quick conversation before he turned to pick up the scaly alien. Meanwhile, the furred one approached me. I sank back deeper into the skiff as the new thing delicately approached.
English.
I heard a new voice inside my head. I clasped my ears, trying to understand how I heard this new thing but didn't.
English.
He repeated, pointing to itself and then to me.
You.
An image of myself flashed in my mind, and I understood it was asking for something belonging to me. I clasped my arms over myself, trying to secret away whatever it might have been attempting to steal from me. And yet the emotion was unmistakable. That was the first time I remembered tenderness, and it made me feel all the more frightened because I did not understand how this creature could have known the way my mother spoke. I thought once more to run again. I glanced towards the open landing pad and to a gangway that led down into the smoggy industry below.
Friend,
the alien said, its fanged mouth smiling. I'd never heard that word before. I would not have even understood its most superficial meaning if not for the emotion that the alien had communicated with it. It was oddly comforting, even though it came from such a strange creature. It offered a webbed hand, but I did not accept it. I understood well enough that I was a prisoner, and seeing as escape was pointless, I got to my feet and waited for direction. Evidently, something I did, or thought, was funny to this English. The creature held its hand to its mouth to conceal a tiny chuckle. It beckoned me toward the ship, and I hesitantly followed. Across the hazy landing pad, we walked up into a new world. The interior of the Ophelion was unnervingly familiar. Not that I had ever seen the ship before, but rather that the vessel was familiar with me. Its plated bulkheads were spacious enough that I could move comfortably. The soft lights were neither too gloomy or too harsh on my eyes. And while there was exposed cabling and rusted sheet metal, it was a kinder neglect than the Mansa's ruthless cynicism. The flying ship I saw outside was still ferocious, but I realized not towards me. For the first time in my life, I walked through a place that had seemed built for me and me alone. I was terrified. I shrunk back, expecting some punishment for this kind of absurd vanity, as if the Mansa were all-seeing and all-knowing. I wondered of their wrath that they should find such a place. Of course, they didn't care about this spaceship, so long as Amon paid the docking fees. English gestured down long corridors and rooms, and as we explored, images and meanings bombarded my mind. I could tell the alien was trying to take it slow, but it was still too fast for me to keep up. Could it not understand that I couldn't understand? Nothing in my life had prepared me for this onslaught. I silently despaired of what role they expected me to fulfill, seeing as it was giving this overwhelming information. And if the work they wanted of me required me to remember all this. As we walked, I grew more and more sullen, despairing of what was going to come next. As soon as they found out I was insufficient, what then? Hopefully they would sell me back to the Mansa, and I could go back to my old life. But it was too easy to envision other awful fates. And all because the alien with my face made a poor purchase. It was cruel, in a way that the Mansa had never been. With the Mansa, the only expectation is the work. That is the only thing they will ever demand of you. That and your obedience. They didn't ask you to think or to judge or to even feel. That was allowed to you and you alone. They didn't care one bit about what you thought. This alien had extended warmth, and I could tell it desired warmth back, but that wasn't fair. It was cruel to expect that. It was cruel to demand more. I did not understand why this alien wanted me to comprehend so much for so little apparent purpose. It was wrong, and I knew resentment began to fester in me. If this is how my new masters treated me, then maybe I would fail intentionally. Whatever they set me to do, I would refuse. I would treat them in turn as they treated me, and then they would do away with me. They could do whatever awful thing they might do to me, and I imagined so much, but at least then I would have some control again. English suddenly stopped in the corridor, and it looked at me with some mixture of surprise and sympathy on its face. At least, that was all I could guess with the scarlet cloth around its eyes.
Friend.
It spoke again, as if the word had held some special meaning. Until that time, I had been equating that word with what the Mansa taught me, which when you translate to basic would have meant roughly second worker or unit. Both exist only in relation to the combined value they provide for the whole. The Mansa view everything in transaction, and that thought may be horrifying for many species, but that is because they do not understand the liberation that comes with it. To live as a Mansa is to live as if there were no such thing as love or friendship or even kindness. The worker would sacrifice itself for another because it was for the good of the all, not for any other reason. And for the Xeno-Urtaf, this meant we could also reduce everything to transaction. We lived our lives free of heartbreak and as much suffering as could be materially avoided. English shook its head. It tried to further associate that warm feeling with the term, gesturing between me and it. But as was earlier, I was only more frustrated by the demand. I couldn't call forth that feeling at my will, and surely not in the quantity this alien would expect from me. It was asking for something I could not provide, and it made me all the more angry for such an unreasonable demand. Instead of becoming annoyed at me, English grew thoughtful for a moment.
Friend.
Appeared in my head again with the same warm feeling, but this time it was not referring to me mutually. The alien was expressing its relationship towards me, No matter what I did or said or thought, this friend was going to remain friend. That made me pause for a moment, as it was no longer asking something from me, but rather giving only in turn. It was a blessing that the Mansa had never taught me to lie. At least never taught me to expect it, as it would have shunned such an outrageous proposition. I did not understand the full implication, but the warm feeling was at least pleasant. It was like those rarest of days on Giza 6, when one could walk on the surface and feel its orange sun on your skin. I had experienced this only once or twice in my entire life. Feeling very disconcerted by all this strange talk, I could only think to ask for my roll. English thought again for a moment.
To wait.
I again began to grow frustrated, and I used a word I had nearly forgotten.
Why?
English put it very simply, and more in images than in words for the sake of my comprehension. However, I shall translate what I understood.
Because you aren't ready to understand what you are.
Chapter 3. Leaving Giza 6. I have often been asked whether I ever felt tempted to return to Giza 6. The answer was twice. The first time was when I wished to investigate the fate of the Aurora, the colony transport I was on, which later crashed onto the planet. I once asked Amon why he didn't stay to look for it or search for other survivors. He replied that since I was under the care of the insects, there were no other survivors. And after 10 years, there would have been nothing of the colony ship. What Amon said was true, but I have long suspected he had another reason for departing so quickly. He could have spent 1,000 years turning over every stone on Giza 6 and still never have been sure if there was another human out there. Amon has had much experience chasing hope for centuries and still never finding it. I do not think he could have borne that heartbreak again. The second time I wanted to return was at the head of an armada. I wanted to seize the planet and turn it into paradise. But as I have come to believe, it would be unwise to force the insect to live as men just as much as I could never live as a Mansa. We are of a different kind, and so long as they are content to stay to their worlds, I have no quarrel with them. English took me to a port window to watch as we departed the planet. The ship creaked and hummed as it took off. For a long time, all I could see was a smoggy haze. But the yellow clouds began to lighten, and as the minutes passed, I could see a rolling horizon of clouds and the tops of the gargantuan mega-buildings off in the distance. Then the world began to darken and fall further and further away until Giza 6 was a putrid sphere in a vast emptiness. I watched it grow smaller and smaller until I could finally see it no longer. And once it was out of sight, I realized that it didn't ache to breathe anymore, and I was already used to the clean air of the aphelion. English had already shown me my living quarters, but they didn't start to become comfortable until a few weeks had passed, and it was only long after that I came to realize that this was my new home, an epiphany I would have several times as I would come to better understand the word. I was given a cramped cabin with little more than a bunk, a few meters of space, and a small window out into the stars. But compared to my habitation pod, this meager space was almost too big for me to know what to do with it. I never got used to sleeping in a bed. It was too soft, and the linens were always too warm. I would often have dreams of falling down a bottomless abyss, and then I would wake in a pool of my own sweat. And no matter how many times English pushed and prodded, she would always find me sleeping on the floor next morning. Since those days, I have compromised on a Rhodeshi sleeping hammock. English wouldn't budge on eating, though. I was to eat my rations with a fork and knife or not at all. When I complained that the Mansa never used utensils, she replied that we weren't Mansa. I asked why it was required for us and not for them, and she said that Mansa only have 3-fingered claws, and as such they can't experience the privilege of an eating ritual.
Food is a delight that many in the galaxy can't understand. Take the Delphian, for example. They lack the appendages to manipulate their food.
English sank her fork into a cut of dry meat.
They can eat, but they can never savor. It's only nourishment to them. They have invented elaborate dances and gestures to try to come close to what we take for granted, but it's never the same.
She took a bite and continued.
It would be a waste for me to not enjoy the hands that were given to my kind, and it would be a tragedy for you who were born for them.
Of course, that lesson came much later, when I had expanded my grasp of galactic basic. At the start, English was more concerned that I learned the hows and not the whys. She sat me down every day at the ship's mess and instructed me how to speak with her psionic gift, along with plenty of data slates. I do not know how long it would have taken me to learn language had it not been for her abilities. Years, at least. I have often wondered what would have happened if I had possessed no language at all. English had told me there comes a point in the mind's maturation where if language is not grasped, it can never be learned, even for humans. It becomes a problem of the brain structure, and I have always been fascinated with that. The idea that language is as physical as anything else. English also gave me lessons, simple at first. I recall one of my first difficulties was associating age with growing old and natural death. You see, the Mansa do not grow old. They reach their allotted number of years and then are promptly euthanized. As such, I understood that I had a number of years, and that at the end I would be taken like the rest. When English was teaching me about lifespan, I was confused because I didn't know how the Mansa would find me again.
You, 1,000.
English corrected. A series of images flashed in my head of me getting bigger, taller, and then I stopped growing, stopped changing for a while. But as the years passed, slowly wrinkles and gray hair appeared. They were barely noticeable at first, but they multiplied. I lived, and I continued living, but I was getting weaker. However, it wasn't until the end that old age seemed to hit me all at once. What took centuries now took decades. Dark spots appeared in my face. My white hair all but fell out. My back grew stooped, I lost weight and withered away. And finally, I was bedridden, and then I was dead.
Amon, 643.
She explained.
How long you?
I asked, startling her with the unexpected question. English hesitated for a moment.
50.
She spoke in my head, but there were no images this time.
How old now?
I asked immediately after. She laughed at my abruptness. Evidently I broke some decorum, but there was a saddened pensiveness in her voice when she spoke.
27.
I didn't know how to spot it then, but she was bearing the telltale marks of middle age for her species. She had no children of her own, and she had already come to the end of those years. It was difficult for me to learn that she had lived more than half her life, and I had already lived more than half even that. I knew English in less time than I have fought wars and raised whole star systems. Her life was shorter than an hour's watch, hardly a blink of my eye, and yet she will forever be a mother to me. English, wherever you are now, I want you to know this. When I stood on the magma dunes of Kazaret and saw the setting of its 3 suns, when I watched it rain sapphires in the core of Khazar 9, when I looked out and I saw time and space collapse in the event horizon of the Eye of Nihilus, I did not for one moment forget you, and I wished you had been there with me. How shall I describe the ship? The Ophelion was an end of an era. The 5th aberration, the war that brought half the galaxy to its knees, demanded mankind take one last stand for its numerous progeny. And so, in the haste of war, humanity fashioned this small cargo ship into a weapon that flew on glass wings. Its shields were strong enough to dive into the corona of a blue giant, but its hull was as flimsy as sheet paper. It could bring to bear 6 missile batteries and even a rail cannon, but it had nothing in the way of point defense systems or even a laser grid. It could outfly and outfight a Kabara fleet, but just one antimatter strike would send the old ship to her grave. And this ship was tragically old. Just like Amon Russ, it had outlived the war it was meant to die in. It was a zero sword kept sheathed in a time of peace, a weapon no longer needed and left to rust. Even though back then I had no appreciation of its history, I could see the love lavished on it by its crew, but it was sadly nowhere near enough. Its impressive armaments were little more than memories of better times. The rail cannon was a rusted tube of steel, without the chromium shells to fire. The shields were a patchwork that provided less than 50% coverage on a good day. And all the other equipment was either past its expiration date or salvaged from somewhere else. There were whole decks that were dark, whole maintenance and access shafts that hadn't been opened in decades. Several centuries' worth of patch jobs, bypassed circuitry, and spare parts made it seem as if the innards of the ship were spilling out of its walls. There was an ever-present layer of dust that seemed to burden the ship more than any cargo, and with every thrum of its engine, the ship ached in protest. It belonged in a museum, and its historical value was such that Amon Russ could have made a fortune selling it. He could have purchased the nicest pleasure yacht in the galaxy and sailed off to spend his twilight years in comfort. Instead, he worked to the bone to keep his ship flying. He knew the days of the Ophelion were drawing to an end, and once it finally found its resting place, I often imagined a barren desert world somewhere. There would never be another like it to soar the stars. Not long after we departed the planet, Ingrish went to the medical bay to check up on Amon. She had wanted me to return to my quarters, but I asked to come along, not wishing to be locked in my room. I was quite used to the freedom of the manse's neglect, and I was finding the sudden attention of these new aliens quite frustrating. I wondered when, if ever, I would enjoy the same freedom again. Despite my limited vocabulary and strange methods of thought, I was not stupid. I knew better than to accidentally vent myself out of an airlock or to ingest engine lubricant. It was just that I had a peculiar way of thinking, a Mansa way of thinking, and I was struggling to cross that gulf between the insect and other species of the galaxy. I was deprived, yes, but I was never incapable. The medical bay was a rectangular room lined with beds and a hermetically sealed surgery suite at the end. To the left was a conference room which doubled as a computer lab. Amon Russ was standing in front of the glass window overlooking the surgery suite. Inside, the scaly alien laid on a bed that was just large enough to accommodate it. There was another alien inside, the doctor presumably, who was operating a large machine that hung from the ceiling. All manner of clamps, syringes, scalpels, and even a buzzsaw were suspended above by metallic extender arms. Right now, most of it was powered down. The doctor was finishing up stitching the scaly one's stump. But it wasn't the machine that made my skin crawl, it was the surgeon. I had seen more new aliens that day than I usually saw in a year, but this was the one that unsettled me. Its head was distended into a bulbous, ridged orb that looked way too big for its otherwise spindly body. Its sagging gray eyes and bony cheekbones were the only things you could see behind its ovoid respirator mask. It wore white surgical robes that concealed the rest of its thin frame. But the thing I fixated on were its long fingers twice the length of my own. Very few are not repulsed by true aliens, or rather, those rare species that did not originate from Sol. Standing in the same room put me on edge. Whenever I encounter such a species, I was always struck with a feeling that we came from two worlds that should never have met. I have read that since the days of human antiquity, we had looked up into the stars and wondered whether there was life out there. I only wish we spent more time considering why such vast distances had been placed between us to begin with.
Stitches are complete.
Todd wheezed through his respirator.
Our guest should require minimal maintenance until we reach the Aquarius sector.
The Belazar began to speak too quickly with Amon for me to follow. As they were conversing, Ingrish and I approached. I did not want to catch this alien's interest, so I walked behind her. But the alien's dilated eyes fell on me anyway. I could not read its expression, but there was a cold judgment in that gaze. I wondered if that was the creature's personality, or if it was something that was endemic to the race. Tut turned back to Amon.
A new one. Shall I have him undergo implantation?
Don't touch him, the old warrior replied. Don't even go near him. The Belazar nodded indifferently, packing up its equipment inside the chamber. Glancing toward us, Amon asked Ingrish, So, how is our new friend? The word was still unusual to me at this point, and I would have much preferred the colder but more familiar Urtaf. Ingrish nodded, and with her telepathy she shared her conversation with Amon. It's going to take us 3 years to get back to Aquarius, Amon told her. Relays are too expensive out here, and they attract the wrong kind of attention. We're going to keep to dark space as much as possible, but I don't want us to go to stasis bays until we leave Mansa territory. Ingrish nodded, and the two began discussing specifics. It was annoying as they immediately leapt to the least interesting part of the conversation: ration meals, flight plans, and life support efficiency. Meanwhile, I was stunned of the prospect of going to a new world. Ingrish noticed my hesitancy, and a rush of images flooded my mind to help me keep up, but I quickly gave up and focused solely on the destination. The picture that stuck in my head was an ocean world with cities raised on mighty habitation towers above the crashing waves. Its name was Niad, and for a moment I stood awestruck as I had never seen so much water before. But even more overwhelming was the city. I saw thousands of different aliens of all shapes and sizes. I saw great streets and marketplaces and apartment mega-complexes. I saw sweeping vistas from the hover cars of the floating skyways to the hab lounges of the deepest underwater gardens. I saw a world of commerce and prosperity, and although English assured me that this was just the farthest edge of galactic civilization, I had great difficulty believing anything could be more majestic. But there was something in the image that deeply disturbed me. Before Amon, I thought I was the only one of my kind, but I was proven wrong. And so it stood to reason that there were others out there, and from this great multitude there should have been many others somewhere. However, in this picture English had shown me, this great hub of civilization, I didn't see any of my kind out there. Not a single one. I wondered where they all were. Chapter 4. Dark Space. Dark space earned its name. It's like an expanse of translucent storm clouds with terrible thunder. You could almost mistake it for atmospheric weather. Except those clouds are not water vapor and those flashes of light are not lightning. They are exotic matter from another layer of the universe. Ships can travel through this subdimension and shorten journeys that would take centuries to mere months. However, every use of the Ibis engine shreds space-time, opening breaches for the storm to pour through into real space. And so starships are required to travel the edges of the star system before entering and exiting FTL. On approach, it looks like a great maelstrom of dark energy slowly enclosing in on civilization. While that sounds frightening, the dark space that has leaked into galaxies still constitutes a fraction of a % of the total vacuum. I'm told it will take billions of years before the overuse of Ibis FTL will begin threatening star systems. If we're not out of the galaxy by then, we're probably already extinct. And in the meantime, dark space has a useful role in scrambling sensors. It's the travel you choose if you prefer to keep quiet and out of sight. Space travelers are often warned not to look too long into these storms. They say it drives you mad after a while. You start seeing things that can't be there, strange planets rolling in the dark, ghost ships that appear in and out of reality. And most feared of all, the baleful monoliths of the aberrants. I have never put much stock in the stories. Even when I was young, I had no trouble staring out into that howling void. And now, I have spent so many centuries in spacecraft that it is a second home to me, a rare place of rest and solace in a very indifferent galaxy. Besides, I also know now that the aberrants do not originate from dark space. Their realm is further off. Yet, I would still be lying if I claimed I had not seen things in those clouds I couldn't explain. English had difficulty persuading me to go to the medical bay again. After seeing Tut and the surgery suite, the last thing I wanted was to enter that room again. Even when she said the Belazar wouldn't be there, I had my reservations. In the days following my entrance onto the ship, it was still a new thing, learning to trust. The Mansa were simple to understand, and they never lied, at least not to the lowly Xeno-Urtaf. These new aliens had not lied yet, but my understanding of deceit had radically awakened with their arrival. I did not understand them, and so there opened a whole new range of miscommunication that I had long theorized but never seen in practice. For a long time I was envious of English and her telepathy. It seemed she had access to the simplicity that I had lost when Amon Russ took me from the Mansa. And returning to these early days, I was surprised when she mentioned offhandedly that she loathed her telepathy and only uses her abilities when necessary.
My species isn't well liked in the galaxy. We're barred from stepping on many worlds. Even among our own people, we seldom form friendships or lasting bonds,
she said.
Why? Because we see others completely, and that means we see them often at their worst. If we choose to care for another, we have to do so knowing who they really are, and that's a harder thing than people care to admit.
Just don't do anything wrong, I said. English chuckled.
That's one way. But for the rest of the galaxy, I like to imagine people as what they could be instead of what they are. I think that's how we'd all like to be seen.
I still think of that conversation, and I have always tried to live out that noble idea, even though few will ever give me that same courtesy. And I believe even in those terrible circumstances, when justice does not ask but demands you take a life, that you ought to do so mercifully. So when the zero sword is thrust through the heart, it is done not with wrath, but pity. But returning to the medical bay, English finally persuaded me inside. She ran me through a scanner that told her everything that you might have guessed from my haggard appearance. I had lived my life eating Mansa food, drinking Mansa water, breathing Mansa air. To say I had developmental deficiencies would have been an understatement. I had deep sores that refused to heal. Most of my teeth needed to be repaired or regrown. I learned my lungs had been scarred from a childhood of breathing poison. My body was little more than skin draped over bones. English gave me a dozen shots that day, ranging from vito fluid to immune system boosters to bone marrow stims. I was quickly put on a regimen of heavy maturation cocktails to reverse the decade-long damage to my body. It was painful at times, and often I would go to the medical bay dragging my feet, but it is quite the thing to learn what health feels like after a lifetime of sickness. It is not merely freedom, it is a whole new world, a new way of experience. To just take in a full breath of air is a delight most take for granted. I am convinced existence itself is a joy that people forget through repetition. But every breath is a miracle, and I have vowed never to be ungrateful. As I was sitting on one of the beds, English put a small device over my finger, and I felt the prick of a needle. I was in a sour mood, and it made me all the more irritated. I had already been subjected to the syringes, and while their pain was annoying, at least I knew what to expect. The surprise at the small gadget was nearly enough for me to storm out of the room. English took the little clasp away and typed on one of the computers. I crossed my arms. "Why?"
That's the last one.
English promised, her attention solely on the screen.
Needed a blood sample.
"Why?" I repeated, angrier than before.
To find out where you are from.
English told me. The answer caught me off guard. I was from Giza 6. There was nowhere else. It wasn't so much that it was my home, it was more than that. It was my center. It was what I knew. Growing up, you believe that the whole of reality revolves around you. And slowly that extends to what is around you as well. I thought Giza 6 was the center of the galaxy, and the history of Giza 6 was the history of the galaxy. To learn there was more to the story was unsettling. I felt something had been kept from me, something I ought to have known. For the first time, I felt a sense of violation. It would be far from the last time.
There are markers in your blood. It won't tell us a lot, but it'll give us an idea of the planet that you are from.
English ran the final calibrations, inserting the small box into a computer port. I was suddenly struck with a sense of fear. English was giving me answers, but what if I didn't like them? What if I didn't want to know? That's the terrible thing about knowledge. You can never take it back. You can only learn to live with it, and live with it I did. Before I could say another word, English suddenly clapped with delight and turned the computer screen towards me.
Call,
She announced cheerfully.
You're from Call Prime, that is. Amon told me about it once or twice. It's a lovely little planet, right at the edge of Vivint sector.
The computer showed a verdant green and blue planet with 2 silver moons. It orbited a soft yellow star, and I saw a rich lushness that took my breath away. I did not know the word for garden then, but that is how I would have described Call. Pictures popped up on the side that showed splendorous white buildings rising out of thick jungles. I saw many open lakes with crystal clear water. There were so many colorful plants and animals that I could have spent all day asking English for their names. I wondered immediately what my life would have been like if I had grown up there instead of Giza 6. My heart pounded with excitement of the prospect of going there one day.
Is that where?
I fumbled for the correct language. I still had difficulty pronouncing the word for human.
The rest of me are?
The excited smile flickered darkly for a moment on English's face, and she hesitated with an answer.
Well, maybe, I guess you could say it's...
No, they're not. Amon appeared in the doorframe outside. I nearly jumped up from the bed in surprise. I had no idea if he had been eavesdropping, or if he had happened down the hall. It was always impossible to tell with the man. He had a gift for not announcing his presence unless he wanted it known. English stood up and thumbed her webbed hands nervously. You ran him through the scanner, correct? Been putting this off, but he's not simple, is he? Amon asked boredly. I had no idea why Amon was asking how mechanically complex I was, but I suppose there was a meaning and was not picking up.
There's nothing wrong with his brain, just an insect's upbringing,
English answered. That's good. Amon walked over to the computer screen depicting Call. I would have had to take him to Sanctuary otherwise. Still might. I haven't decided. It's just not a good place for kids anymore. I don't know if they would even take him.
You should keep him. He's bright, you'll see,
she told Amon. Well, he's not going anywhere for the time being. Amon put a finger on the computer screen, right where the planet was being shown. That's not Call. You're showing him what it was nearly 1,000 years ago. Ingrid nodded her head, abashed at Amon for calling out her deception.
Do we need to tell him so soon? It's only been a few days.
You don't need to coddle him. You see him as a child, but this kid survived a Mansa childhood. That means he's a fighter. He can take the hard knocks. Amon turned to me, his eyes quickly sizing me up. He crossed his arms. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions about us humans, why we're the only two aboard and why you're not going to sea anywherever we go. Well, now's the time to ask while I'm still in a good mood. Ingrid translated his words and intent, but I had only one question.
Where?
Nowhere, he answered. At least nowhere in big enough numbers to matter. There might be about 100,000 of us or so, scattered across the length and breadth of the galaxy. But there's no cities or planets, not really. The galaxy is home to quadrillions, so it's hard to find each other. He tapped a few keys on the computer screen, and I saw a new Call, the real one. The white spires were either overgrown with plants or crumbling. The hollow ruins didn't just look empty, they looked starkly abandoned. The beautiful jungle became something altogether sinister, like it was hiding a grave. No, it was worse. It was erasing the fact that we had been there at all. This was my home. I didn't know the word back then, but for the first time, I felt homesick for a place and people I never knew. If I had been on that planet, in those ruins, I would have run from building to building, shouting for anyone to answer back. I felt my heart ache from the loneliness of those image pics. There was much I didn't know, more still untold, but my throat clenched in somber realization. I looked back at Eamon.
Why?
The look on Eamon's face told 1,000 regrets and more. It isn't too complicated. Just the slow march of time. Time, and a war we shouldn't have fought. Amon Russ was a man of stories. He never liked to tell them, but you could see that they were there, etched in every wrinkle and scar on his weathered face. His pale blue eyes never seemed to be looking at you, his mind constantly distracted by what must have been countless memories. He was the kind of man who had 1,000 friends and twice as many enemies. Forlorn loves born across the galaxy and one heartbreak that he always carried with him. He was the kind of man whose anger was as wrathful as a star, and whose sorrow was as bitter as the loneliest of tomb worlds. He was a man who knew too much but had lived too late. If you knew him, you probably only knew the indifferent and insensitive warrior. If you knew him like I did, you would know he was a man who cared too much, and every night he was counting all his mistakes. His rough features spoke clearly of the battlefield, and not the glorious sort, but also not the kind a good man ought to walk away from. His silver goatee and hair was just losing the last of its brown color, yet he was remarkably lean, and he looked strong enough to wrestle with a Gruk. He told me that day about the 5th Aberrant War, about the things that couldn't die, the things still shrieking as EM ghosts in the void. But even before that, mankind was dying. We had been the masters of the galaxy, the first to conquer the stars, and it was that victory which defeated us. As far as humanity was concerned, we had created utopia, and we died in the fires of that utopia. By the billion, we bled over the long centuries, and we thought nothing of it. Our long lifespans were frittered away for the sake of blind pleasures, and it was often so ugly that even now I shudder to think of how low a species can fall. But I will spare you the more awful details. They should be easy to find for the curious anyway. For this account, you only need to know humanity fell into the most awful depravity. Many sterilized themselves, made themselves into willing eunuchs for the sake of the ecstasy plugs. They dedicated their efforts to building great ships and even whole planets for nothing more than base indulgence. Some were as extreme as to opt for euthanasia, trying to ascend into a digital consciousness, which was in fact no true consciousness. Over thousands of years, our numbers dwindled until we held nothing more than a few planets, populated by the few who remembered our past glories. We had the most powerful ships and weapons, but they didn't matter without the numbers to use or maintain them. Whole battle fleets fell into disrepair or were sold off to the highest bidder. And whenever we fought, every loss whittled away the fewer and fewer people we had. The galaxy was more than happy to accommodate our decline. For every species that was for us, twice were against, wanting to be their own masters. Where we once walked with our heads held high, we hid in the shadows, fearful of attracting unwanted attention. Yet still we won every war we fought, except the last one. Then we were blown away like dust in the wind. Amon had been born on the cusp of the end centuries ago now. He was there for all of it, and he was there for everything that came after. The galaxy knew him as the hero of the Battle of Perseus, a young, daring pilot who single-handedly took down an aberrant cruiser with nothing more than a fighter and a singularity bomb. From pictures of his younger days, he looked as though he could take on the whole universe. But I never knew that man. I only knew the man he became to me. He was my father. Chapter 5. The Derelict. Ingrish woke me up in the middle of the night ship time. She knelt over me and gently put a hand on my shoulder. I jumped from my resting place on the floor, recoiling at her touch. I backed into the corner of my quarters as she tried to approach. The Bacche smiled, but from the way she picked at her hands, I could tell she was unsettled. The crimson cloth around her eyes had been fastened hastily, and her silk gown was ruffled.
We need to go to the bridge,
Ingrish told me.
Amon wants all the crew accounted for.
Why? I asked, glaring with timid scorn. Reflecting back, Ingrish's patience has always amazed me. Not a week had passed since we took off from Giza 6, and once I learned why was an acceptable question to ask, I had not wasted the many opportunities. I was always suspicious, always searching for that unexplainable reason why these strange people had taken me from the Mansa. Despite everything Ingrish had tried to do for me, I still resented her, and I would for a time yet. Perhaps that is why she took such a liking to me. I never lived in fear of her abilities, and I never put on that guise of dishonesty which the galaxy calls good manners. The Mansa had not taught me to worry about such things.
We stumbled on a ship.
Ingrish quickly explained.
It could be dangerous. If so, Amon needs us somewhere safe.
Reasonably satisfied with that answer, I finally obeyed. I hesitantly nodded and followed her out of my quarters. We briskly walked down the dim corridors of the Aphelion, and up a set of ladder stairs that opened into a gangway suspended through a ringed access tube. As we passed by, I gawked at the ancient technology that seemed more advanced than the rest of the ship. Inset into the metal paneling were vacuum chambers filled with orange control crystals. Carved into these thin wafers were angular silica patterns that were infinitely varied though unmistakably meticulous in design. The computers here were different also. For the first time, I saw holographic displays on the Aphelion, though they were few and far between. They emitted softly out of ports, reading diagnostic information and sensory data. The floor below us was filled with large black cables that hummed with energy and wound their way from the bridge to the rest of the vessel. I had once got the sense that this access tube and the bridge were of a different, older ship that had been grafted onto the rest of the Aphelion. Our footsteps echoed as we crossed the last threshold onto the bridge. The command center was too big for the ship's current meager crew, much too big. It had room to easily fit 24 or so personnel. The long control consoles which ran along the length of the viewing glass had many unpowered and dark stations, whose purpose I could not guess at. The lonely seats next to them were the only clue that they served any necessary function at all. There was a captain's chair, but it was empty as well. It was covered in a thick layer of dust like so much of the bridge. Amon Russ occupied a forward station on the left, leaning over the ship controls. Seated next to him were Rykar and Kybet. I had seen the two only in passing. The ship's pilot and mechanic were two more aliens that were as nearly as overwhelming to me as Ingrish and Tut had been, but they were quickly the last things on my mind when I saw what was through the viewing glass. Obscured in the dark, rolling clouds of space, lit by flashes of paradoxical and eerie light, I saw a large cargo ship drifting in the distance. Its angular and wedge-shaped design was identical to the Mansa freighters I had often seen docking on the surface of Giza 6. The ship was scarred and much of its insides exposed, likely having gone decades without repair. Along one side was an exposed docking bay for shuttlecraft, open to the vacuum. I was at first afraid that it would come alive and attack us, but the ship remained lifeless. The thrusters were all dark, none of them burning to life. None of the turrets swiveled to take aim, and there wasn't even the quick golden flash of shields being raised. It just floated there, dark, without a single indication that anyone was on board or aware of our presence. "How long have we been in their sensor range now?" Amon asked.
"If they didn't see us the first time,"
Riker asked.
"you know, when we shot past them at full speed? Or when you had the bright idea to turn back for a second readout? Yeah, if anyone's on board that bucket of scrap, they know we're here."
Riker sarcastically clacked. His beak and vocal cords lacked the capacity for human language, but a boxy implant on his neck somehow distorted his shrieking speech into recognizable words. Amon shot him an annoyed look, but it was Kybet who spoke.
"At least we know the auto-nav system still works. It diverted us to a safe trajectory before we would have risked impact."
Ingrish translated the fluster in her voice, and even one such as I noticed that Kybet kept glancing at Amon, as if she was afraid he would turn angry at any second.
"Oh yes, do tell us how close we came to getting atomized. That's going to set my nerves at ease."
Riker snapped at her. Kybet bristled.
I
don't care," Amon interrupted her. "Your first readout said it detected intense zeta particles. That's still true?" Kybet tapped a few buttons and nodded.
"Clustered around the bridge and engine compartments."
"Yeah, that's how they like to kill. Pick a target and follow its trajectory into dark space. Cut off their head before they can raise shields, and then their legs so they can't run. They were probably boarding before the Mansa knew anything was wrong." Riker looked at Amon suspiciously.
"Who? What are you talking about?"
Amon's face barely concealed his anger. "Old friends. You wouldn't know them." He tapped a few buttons on the console, and the Mansa freighter began to slowly grow in the window. "I'm going aboard to look for the survivors. Keep the shields up, and if you see another ship out there, you run. Don't come back for me."
What?
Kybet tried to keep up.
"It's pretty obvious there's no one alive on that ship anymore. Look, I just ran another scan. Their life support is dead. Every compartment is open. It's just vacuum inside."
Amon walked for the access tube. He turned back briefly, and his expression told me more than I wanted to know. "The Zurak always leave survivors." From a screen, we all silently watched as Amon opened the airlock and jumped from the Ophelion onto the Mansa freighter. A camera on his envirosuit gave us his perspective as the metal floor fell away under his feet and the infinite stormy void opened up. It made my stomach churn as I watched him leap through the dark mist, and I held my breath until Amon's magmoots touched down again in the Mansa shuttle bay. The large space was empty of its pushed vessels. I did not know whether they were destroyed in the encounter, or worse, taken. What I did see was the savaged remains of the hangar. Much of the metal plating had been ripped off the walls, and all the internal machinery had been ruthlessly examined. The whole area was a mess of broken parts and scrap metal. The Mansa never had an eye for cleanliness, but I knew this was the work of their attackers. Amon flicked on a flashlight at the end of his assault rifle, and he went towards an iris hatch that had been melted open. Slowly, he climbed over collapsed girders and torn paneling as he entered the dark hallway. Each step of his heavy boots were muffled in the vacuum, reverberating through his suit. I heard his labored breathing over the comm as he forced his way through the cluttered interior. The darkness that surrounded him was worse than the howling void. I kept seeing bizarre shapes and shadows that always threatened to resolve into imagined monsters. Each room was filled with the work of some malign intelligence that had been mercilessly curious with the Mansa ship. And yet, for all the destruction, I didn't see any bodies.
I don't understand. What are the Zurok?
English asked.
They're collectors. Don't know what they look like. I've only ever seen their android servitors.
Amon spoke softly as he pointed his rifle, illuminating another dark room.
Back at the end of the war, they attacked a convoy I was escorting. Killed damn near half our people before we knew it was happening. And counted them half a dozen times since.
How come I've never heard of them?
English pressed.
I've lived my entire life on spaceships. I think I should have known about this.
Because most people who survive the Zurok don't go on to talk about them.
Could you be more specific?
It's hard to put into words what they do. You'll see soon enough anyway.
Despite the ruined state of the ship, his footsteps moved with careful purpose. Somehow he knew exactly where to go, or rather, where he was most likely to find what he was looking for. He descended 3 decks and came to another iris door that had also been melted open. Behind it was the gaping darkness of a large cargo bay. He stepped into the empty void where 7 cone-shaped pods had been left, churning silently in the center. The angular ribbing of the pod reminded me of the Mansa's chitinous exoskeletons, yet the texture and design was utterly alien. These devices were smooth and pristine, not made by insects, but rather with a geometric precision, or perhaps beauty, that suggested a careful and oppressive mind. Not quite an egg sac and neither a stasis pod, but something in between. Yellowish-green fluid swirled behind some viscous substance that was similar to glass, and I saw the dark silhouette of a Mansa Urtaf covered in dark veins which threaded the interior of the pod.
What is?
I asked in horror. Amon hadn't heard me, but he answered the question he knew we must all be asking.
They're being upgraded. Everything inside them is being turned into something else. They'll awaken and infiltrate their world, looking and talking and acting like Mansa. Don't ask me what for.
Amon pointed his gun.
I've only seen this done on humans, but no one deserves this. Not even the bugs.
And he began firing his weapon. The pods reluctantly burst open as the dark figures inside were torn apart by bullets. Strange pustules ruptured and outspilled a black liquid that mingled with the yellow ooze drifting in the airless compartment. The veins snapped off, and even though the cargo bay was in vacuum, I swore I could hear the shrill cries of the Mansa dying inside.
What was that?
Riker suddenly pointed a talon toward the Mansa vessel. I hardly noticed him, and I didn't look to see what he was talking about. All I was feeling in that moment was a sense of horror and a mixed pity for both myself and the Mansa who died. It is one thing to know your masters can die, but to see them brutalized in such a way destroyed the last thing I thought I knew about the universe. I was a slave, and as a slave I thought the Mansa were invulnerable, when in fact they were no more than a tiny mound of insects. The only thing that spared them from being crushed was the indifference of the galaxy. I was a slave, and yet my masters themselves had been slaves, and I realized then what I should have known when I saw the crumbling ruins of Kal, that no one is ever beyond death and shame. That is not what I thought or could think in that moment on the Athelian's bridge. I still had a simple mind, but that half-formed lesson instructed with the silent shrieks of my dying masters taught me the true nature of the galaxy. And it was then I noticed the many-legged machine which had now scuttled onto the bridge's viewport. I recall a great many things happening at once. Riker attempted to activate the bridge's blast shields, but the drone was faster. Its thorax opened up, and a laser pierced through the glass and hit Kybet in the head, vaporizing half her porcelain face and neural cables. English shrieked and grabbed my hand, yanking me away towards the access tube. Riker upholstered his pistol and began firing, dodging the laser as it swept through the bridge. I do not recall the noise of the air being depressurized. It is actually quite soft. But I felt a gentle breeze on my face and the sudden thinness of the clean air that I had so quickly taken for granted. Emergency shields flickered on to stabilize the atmosphere, but the field wasn't strong enough to keep out the attacker. The drone crawled its way inside while Riker and Kybit fled in different directions. Perhaps it was because we were the larger group that the drone chased us. Or perhaps it was merely random chance. Whatever the case, we were the preferred targets. Riker had disabled its main laser with his gunfire, but the drone still had its legs, manipulator claws I saw now, that were quite capable of eviscerating us. The machine was utterly silent, save for a clicking noise that might have been from the damage to its internal components. Its eye, embedded into the ovoid thorax, was focused solely on us. Before then, I had seen plenty of weapons meant to kill. This was the first time I had seen a weapon meant, as I presume now, to kill painfully. The manipulator claws, once scalpels meant for cleaving through glass, grew serrated blades which lashed at us as we ran down the corridors of the Aphelion. We practically threw ourselves around every corner and turn we could, hoping to lose the machine thing. It moved more gracefully and quickly beyond any predator animal could hope to achieve, and if we were to take too long down a corridor, we were dead. I felt the wind from one of the blades across my neck, and I cried out. My lungs were fire, and my poor body, malnourished and sickly, could not keep up for long. I screamed for it all to stop, as if that would do anything. All I knew was fear, and that was what kept me running as long as I did. Every minute felt like an hour, and nothing entered my mind except desperately trying to get away. We jumped down several sets of ladder stairs while the drone crashed after us. Its claws sunk into the walls and even ceiling to propel itself forward. It jumped and dashed and lunged after us, each attempt getting a hair's breadth closer. The ground we seemed to gain was lost as quickly. It seemed hopeless that all we were doing was delaying our excruciating deaths. It was at that point I just wanted the pain to stop. Anything was worth it to avoid the attention of this monster. As we rounded the bend, I made a snap decision. And once another corridor branched off, I tried to tear myself away from Ingrish's iron grip on my wrist. I thought at the time if I could just get away, or more accurately, if the drone still chased after Ingrish, that I could get to safety. It was the sort of selfishness that only a child could have. But unknown to me, Ingrish had been leading us somewhere. She had been communicating with Amon on the comm and didn't have the time to translate. And I, foolishly trying to make it on my own, stopped us for a brief instant in the hallway. That was more than enough time for the drone to catch up. I have 6 regrets. 6 wounds as fresh as the day they were made. Like a branding laser forever engraving my heart, those sins are marked upon me. If the blood of Sid Kenu truly has been sacrificed and the axios of death have been inverted, perhaps one day I will be able to sleep soundly at night. But until that day, my first regret was that I tried to leave Ingrish to die. Ingrish did not let go of my wrist, and when the drone came upon us, she screamed and threw herself over me to shield me from the blades. We fell upon the floor, and I felt one of the serrated claws plunge right into Ingrish's back. It went deep, and tearing out a great deal of flesh, I saw the white corridor ceiling splatter with blood. With horror, I looked at this woman who had all but thrown her life away in a desperate attempt to save my own. What's more, I could not even begin to understand it, nor did I have time to, as the drone raised another claw to pierce her again. But just as it was about to fall for the killing blow, a hail of bullets issued out from the airlock hatch. The drone was blown apart into a million fragments, and I saw Amon Russ step into the hallway. He ran over to Ingrish, and picking her up, he asked if I was okay. I nodded, still in shock. I sat up, and I saw him rush the broken and bloodied body of my mother to the medical bay. Chapter 6. Long Goodbyes. There is nothing quite like the shame of a child who has made a mistake which he can't put right again. I recall the clicking disappointment of my epitaph as I accidentally spilled a canister of agri-fluid out to the maggot farms. Even at such a young age, I did my utmost to appease the Mansa. That next morning, I approached my supervisor as he was assigning tasks for the day. I skipped the long lines of Urtaf and ran directly to the creature who had been my caretaker. It pretended not to notice me as it continued its duties, and trying to get its attention, I had tugged on its mechanical claw, hoping to hand over my rations for the day. More than anything, I wanted to repair a relationship that I realized later never existed. No longer able to ignore me, my patef violently seized my head and slammed me against the ground until I was unable to get back up again. I still do not know whether it had intended to kill me that day. I don't think so. He wouldn't have wanted to waste a worker, even one as inefficient as me. It was more a matter of not understanding how delicate a human child was compared to a fully grown mansa. Regardless, I did not make either mistake again. And yet this sentimental instinct, which I had thoroughly learned was evil, as close as I could understand such a concept, reared its head once more as I dazedly stumbled after Amon Russ into the medical bay. Tut was already there waiting by a medical bed, a strange pattern that the Belazar would often repeat over the years. I could scarcely recall a time when someone alerted him over the comm of an emergency, and yet there he always stood, almost eager to practice his bloody profession. Amon placed English on a medical bed, and I saw to my horror that she was no longer breathing. She had passed in the few minutes it took for Amon to sprint here. If Tut was concerned by the early death of his patient, he didn't show it. Instead, I saw his drooping eyes quickly pass over her. His bulbous head nodded once over to Amon, and the old man's shoulders fell with an expression I could not read. Tut got to work immediately, taking a syringe and pressing it forcefully into her neck. The Belazar inserted 2 sharp tubes into Ingrish's wrist. A machine hummed as it began pumping viscous vita fluid into her veins. Tut's elongated fingers moved with a perturbed frenzy as he began using all manner of small devices, some pronged, others spun and whirred, still others gleamed like glass and crackled like ice. His fingers were all equally tipped with steel thimbles which ended in sharp points. Their purpose I could not guess at either. However, the way he speedily sliced and jabbed and prodded, I could scarcely believe he was not butchering Ingrish's insides. But the thing I looked for, the rise and fall of her chest, did not come. Each second was an eternity, and each one felt like the grim ticking down of an invisible clock. I did not know when was the threshold of no return, or when Tut would give up his grisly task. I could only watch the methodically and frustratingly inscrutable work. And while working with a focus, no, obsession, only possible by select aliens born under strange skies, Tut conversed cordially with Amon. I can only assume that he was giving updates with Ingrish's condition. But as my translator was dead, I could only catch a few words.
Has multiple possible ruptures. Failures in not.
Tut's casual cadence broke as he pulled out a single vial containing a silver fluid. Amon caught the alien's arm as Tut was about to plunge a syringe into one of the vials. Only way? The man asked sharply. Tut nodded again. Amon hesitantly let go. I could understand a boundary was being crossed, but without the context I knew nothing of what it meant. Ingrish had hardly sat me down to teach me language, and yet I frantically tried to recall everything, searching for that one clue which would reveal everything. And when it did not come to me, all I was left with was a despair that threatened to choke the breath from my throat. Ingrish should have meant nothing to me. I had told myself this many times, but now, seeing her mangled body, seeing as she had so quickly thrown her life aside for my own, now those words felt like sin. One strangely more awful than the one which cost her life. I had learned to hold back tears, as the Mansa had no use nor need of them. But I could not bear to keep my grief silent any longer, even though I did not understand why. I sobbed, and gasping for breath, looking through wet and blurry eyes, I saw to my utmost horror that Amon had noticed. It was too much. All of it was too much. The guilt alone should have stomped my heart and killed me where I stood. I did not understand why it didn't, and like any human child who had just lost his mother, I did the only thing a child could do when his world came crashing down around him. I ran back to my room. When I think of that child, huddled in the dark corner of his sleeping quarters, and as I stand now, peering in the dark light over hollow maps and drawing invasion plans, I am struck by how inescapably human humans are. Try as some might, we cannot get away from our own natures. I don't think any species really can. As humans, we grieve, we play, We laugh and frown, we hope and dream, we fall in love, and yes, we make war. Nothing about us has changed since we stepped off Terra all those long-lost millennia ago. A child raised by insects still had tears to shed, and when he became a man, he then went to war. I cannot recall how long I waited there, but I knew until hunger or thirst overtook me I would not leave. The thing I feared most was Amon's face. I still did not fully understand rage. Rather, I most feared the indifference. That had always been the mask of those who had been my masters, and I could not bear the thought of seeing it on him. I could not bear that face directed at me. All sorts of the worst scenarios played out in my head. For some reason, I believed in my delirium that Amon possessed the same power as Ingrish, sensing my selfish intention when I had tried to run away from her. I tormented myself with that phantom for quite a while until I simply laid down and closed my eyes, too exhausted to continue any longer. There were 3 loud clangs on my door, and not knowing what they meant, I did not get up or move. There was silence for a moment before the hatch squeaked open, and Amon took 2 heavy steps into my room. He was no longer wearing his Evo suit, which had been coated with Ingrish's blood. Instead, he had on a brown shirt and cargo trousers. I did not dare look at his face. There was another long pause. I could hear my heart beating in my ears.
You all right?
Amon finally asked.
No,
I answered. Amon sighed. He started to speak once or twice, I think trying to say something intelligibly to me. But after seeing my lack of recognition, he gave up and began talking anyway, though I did not know why. He knew I could not understand, and as broken and exhausted as I was, I could not muster the energy to try to follow what he was saying. I remained in the corner as Amon lingered near the door. Eventually, he went over to the bed. Carefully, his wrinkled hands smoothed the sheets before he sat down. His face was cast in shadow, sometimes glancing over my way, while he spoke a language that was both somehow all too familiar and yet impossible for me to decipher. It seemed to me that he didn't expect me to understand, that his words were somehow more meant for him than I. Catching only the tumult in his voice, I wondered at the cadence and the long, agonizing pauses between sentences. Whatever he said that day, I still do not know for certain what it was. It was the kind of confession you made to a deaf man, or a man on his deathbed. Either way, those words would not be spoken again. Amon's eyes were wet when he finished, and I was none the wiser. He glanced over to me again, and I finally summoned the courage to ask the one question that mattered to me anymore.
English?
Amon exhaled and lowered his head. He tried several combinations of words, each as inscrutable as the last. Finally, he landed on words I did know.
Sleep. A long sleep.
There was only one thing which I understood to be a long sleep on Giza 6, and it crushed my soul. The next few days I spent in a long melancholy. As I had come to learn, I was not to be disposed of for my mistake. Strangely, there was nothing in the way of the punishment I expected, and that somehow made it all the worse. I stayed in my quarters. Kybet was sent down to take care of me. Half her porcelain face was still melted off, though she was quickly reconstructing it. Nevertheless, the grisly sight didn't do anything to ease my mind. She offered me food, which I only accepted after carefully inspecting it. I did not know what these strange aliens did with their dead, though I knew very well what the Mansa practice was. Kybet tried to strike up conversation with me, and while her neural matrices could quickly discern and adapt to my limited vocabulary, I largely refused to talk. And to my surprise, I was neither punished nor reprimanded for it. Instead, Kybet quietly withdrew, only coming around to check up on me every once in a while. I had balked under the constant attention of Ingrish, but I found her absence to be all the worse. Eventually, I could not stand to be in my quarters any longer, and creeping up to my door, I found it to be unlocked and unguarded. Slipping out in my bare feet, I discovered the dimmed lights of nighttime, or what passed for nighttime on the Aphelion. I'd thought to sneak down to the medical bay to see what became of Ingrish, but the thought of running into Tut, and running into him alone, terrified me. I decided instead to wander, to finally explore this new world of mine. I knew where the mess hall was, as well as the bridge and several other ship compartments, but so much of the Ophelion remained a mystery to me. Setting down an unfamiliar corridor, I recall even as a child, I was always more cautious than I ought to be. It is this trait which I credit having saved my life on multiple occasions, being paranoid where others would walk heedlessly. I went down the white-framed hallway slowly, constantly doubling back to make sure I never lost the way to my quarters. And with some spare machine parts that had been in a dust-covered box, I made a trail as I went along. The Ophelion was never a maze, though it was easy to get turned around in the similar-looking corridors. But for those of us who had been on the ship long enough, you start to navigate by the little oddities that come across your path. In one corridor, there was a busted wall panel set on its side next to where an energy conduit had blown out. Take a right and go down about 20 or so meters before you arrive at a T-juncture with an access tube. Climb down 2 decks, and you'll come across a loose grate affixed to an air duct. It had been riddled with bullets at some point, and a dried yellow rust coats the steel halfway down. Crawl through and take 2 lefts. You'll find yourself in a perch above a locked storage room where Riker stashes his Zacon darts. Smoke them in the airlock or cargo bay 5 where the atmospheric sensor blew out. I could tell 100 more stories like that, but for this particular night I found myself in a hexagonal chamber. There was a pillar in the center with 6 bulky pods ringed horizontally around. Cold, wispy air hissed out from the capsules. Hydraulics kept the lids fastened close, but there was a pane of glass which let you see inside. Stooping over them, I saw they were all empty save one. I had finally found out what they had done with the orange alien. It laid there with its scaly eyes closed. Its frills made no movement, and I saw no breath pass from its lips. Much like English, it was now terribly pale. Its arms were at its sides, and a thin layer of frost covered its skin. The Gruck neutralizer was still lodged thoroughly in its neck, though I didn't see the point. The creature was clearly dead, kept in a preservation chamber of some kind. Having been in a somber mood already, this finally broke me. I had no connection or care for this creature, but it, in a sense, was not dissimilar to me, a captive held against his will. What's more, this creature was one of the few reminders that Giza 6 was real, that the place where things made sense was still out there and not some half-forgotten dream. However, what finally broke me was the fact that I could not understand why Amon or his crew had gone to such effort to simply kill the creature. There was so much that I couldn't understand, and so much more that I never would without Ingrish's help. I was lost in a world where nothing made sense anymore, and I was tired of piecing it together. I stared numbly at the alien for a while, then dragging my feet, I went back to my room and fell asleep. I was not altogether surprised a few days later when Amon presented me in front of a pod not unlike the one I saw holding the scaly alien. Kybet had uselessly tried to explain, but I had heard enough when she mentioned a long sleep. I was going to die presently, for what reason I could only guess at. Was it for how I had gotten English killed? Or was it for some other purpose one I couldn't possibly fathom? In either case, I no longer cared. I was simply tired of caring. The only thing I could do, in some bizarre logic that only made sense from a child's mind, was to accept this fate, and hope, in whatever way, that this could make up for what I did to English. I clambered down into the pod, Kybet trying to say something I could not make out over the hiss of cold air and the hydraulics raising the lid. As the metal pod closed shut, I saw Amon's face through the glass. There it was, the thing I most feared, the indifference with which I was so accustomed with my Mansa masters. I closed my eyes and waited for what would come next. There was a breeze of cold air, and I was gone. Chapter 7. 3 years later. Death was not as dreamless as I feared, and it was not as cold. I stood on a sandy beach, waves lapping at my feet, with a great body of water extending past the horizon. It was day, and yet it was also night. A dim sun hung in a tired sky, its red glow fading into black. I looked up, and I saw stars beyond counting. I believed I had had the full measure of the universe when the Aphelion took off from Giza 6, and each time I was proven wrong, I thought that revelation would be the last. But in truth, it doesn't end. There's always a new sky, always a new horizon. It is only those who think they've seen everything, done everything, who truly wither and grow old. There is nothing more wretched and hopeless than a cynic, though we all fall to that vice sooner or later. I think that is why children are necessary. They're too young to forget this truth. In them is a world that is still full of wonder, and they remind us, we who have grown cold to this galaxy, that there is still something worth fighting for. Even after the Fifth Aberrant War, I am convinced humanity could have still come back. As reduced as we were, I must imagine humanity had fared worse some time in our long history. And we were only damned when our arrogant race, who rushed so quickly to prove their primacy in the cosmos, gave up on their own children. Whatever history shall record of the things I have done, I want the galaxy to know I did not make that same mistake. I lingered on that beach for a little while. I was unaware at the time that stasis dreams were made from memories, that what I was experiencing was not the afterlife nor the simulacra of a ship computer. This was in fact Terra, tens of thousands of years ago, after our sun was mortally wounded. There was a name that lingered on the edge of my tongue. I did not know why, but I felt it ought to have been spoken anyway. The water lapping at my legs and even the gristles of sand between my toes seemed to tense, as if the world itself was expecting me to call it out. There was a swell of emotion from someone somewhere. I could not recognize the feeling for many years, only later realizing it was the sadness of a friend who had long forgotten. There was someone else there on that beach. I knew it in my bones, but they were just out of sight. Like someone you could see only from the corner of your eye. I swear I saw a face in the sea mist, the stasis dream struggling to bring forward a faint echo of a thought from the distant past. I knew the name so well, and yet not enough to speak it. I could recall how I felt about every syllable, and yet the sounds eluded me. I shouted out to whoever was there, hoping they could answer the question. But even as I yelled out the plea, it was too late. A cold wind swept up from the ocean. I shivered, and the image faded, this new world blowing away with the invisible breeze. And no sooner had I entered, I awoke again in the stasis bed. I sucked in a deep breath of air as the world became real again, and so with it the freezing cold. It was not a slow niggling of discomfort as one often feels as a dream fades away. I was instantly awake and aware, for I was never really asleep to begin with. I was in the stasis bed, the glass and metal lid being lifted upward. Panicking as one does from such a sudden change in sensation, I threw my shivering hands on the lid, trying to push it up faster. I clambered towards the widening crack, desperately squeezing myself out. I heard someone shout as foreign hands reached inside, attempting to keep me still. I resisted, squirming as I blindly wished for that warm beach again. I winced as the cold became painful, or perhaps it was from the stiffness from the chemical preservation. Either way, my body cried out against me as I did everything to be free of the pod. But the lid finally lifted, and I threw myself onto the floor, scrambling as one does when they did not expect to wake again. My hazy vision was stubborn to clear. My eyes, which had not seen use for 3 years, hurt just to see. Blinking again and again, I saw dark silhouettes above me, and I cried out in fear.
It's all right. It's all right.
I heard a familiar voice in my head, and instantly I grew still. I looked up, and as my vision gradually began to return, I saw an impossible face staring back at me as she was trying to help me up. English. A blanket was thrown over my shoulders, and I was taken to the mess hall. I sat huddled in a chair with my knees drawn close as I watched the woman I had killed preparing us both a meal in the dispensary. I glanced out past the dusty lounge, towards a window and to the passing stars outside. My only explanation was that I did die. And yet why did death now look so much like the Aphelion? Ingrish finally came around and set a plate down in front of me, though I scarcely paid attention to the meal. "How?" I asked. She looked no different than the day she appeared on the Mansa docking port, wearing the same black gown and crimson band around her eyes. Ingrish seemed surprised at my question.
Didn't they tell you? Tot had to put me in stasis so they would have time to fix my organs.
My eyes widened as I finally realized what Amon meant by a long sleep.
But...
I stammered, flashes of images rushing my mind from the syringe of silver fluid to Amon's crying to the dead alien in the stasis pod. Ingrish looked at me in a growing concern as a whirlwind struck my mind. 1,000 half-formed thoughts and images came at once, but it was all too much as tears came to my eyes. I had no conception of higher powers, nor did I grasp what so many in the galaxy call intervention. However, what I could understand was that everything I thought had been lost was now made untrue. Everything horrible had been made right again. And although I would never forgive myself, I had been set loose from the consequences. I was free. And this time, there were no words for my gratitude.
Tot had plenty of time to save me. Death doesn't set in until the neurofibrous circuit is cut.
Ingrish quickly said, perceiving the storm behind my blank expression. I received an image of a complex cellular network that meant absolutely nothing to me. Ingrish tried to explain everything, to calm me back down. Taking a cloth and wiping my wet eyes, she said that the silver syringe was a stabilizing fluid, able to prolong the time one could remain dead and still be able to be brought back. Though, Ingrish was never dead in the proper sense of the word. Cessation of breath, rampant blood loss, even loss of brain activity are all reversible conditions if one has the right tools. In antiquity, these markers were thought to represent death, but we today understand that there is a much finer distinction. Ingrish told me Amon's hesitance was that the syringe was the last of their supply, and if we found ourselves in such circumstances again, it was dubious whether Tut could bring someone back. Although her explanation brought clarity, her nonchalance made me embarrassed I had not realized earlier. And with that embarrassment came a childish anger. I suddenly wished I had someone to blame as I felt like I had been lied to. I found I wanted for someone to have lied to me, for then I would have a right to be angry. "But Amon!" I suddenly yelled, picturing the sight of him crying. It was new to me, this sensation of wanting to vindicate myself. I had no idea why it now so mattered to me that I had been manipulated, that there had been a purposeful deception, even though I knew there had been none. No one was at fault except my own ignorance, but I argued anyway. Ingrish saw the image in my head, and she knew my objection. Why did he grieve when there was nothing wrong? It didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I crossed my arms, expecting her to be stumped, and I admit I took some vicious pleasure in my victory. Ingrish hesitated, setting the damp cloth on the table. Looking back, I don't think she had ever seen Amon cry before. It was a deep shock to her, and she had to take a moment to compose herself.
Amon wasn't crying for me.
She put together what had happened.
He was crying because he thought he nearly got you killed.
It's hard to understand for most species of how indescribably rare it was for two humans to meet one another. By my time, the only place you could reasonably find humans was Sanctuary, a hidden moon on the edge of known space. Its crumbling cities were not unlike Kal, except on an icy world orbiting a crimson gas giant. But besides that, humans in the galaxy often went centuries without seeing another of our kind. The Ark ships were all lost or destroyed, and even if we still had the numbers to construct the giant cylinder worlds, we did not have anywhere to go back to. When a Rodeshi wants to go home, he goes to Rodon. When a Crusticon wants to go home, he goes to Malakon 12. But we had no such place. There was practically nowhere in the galaxy where a human could go to be among his own people. Even on the most bustling Ecumenopolis, a human always walks alone. And this was a great problem for us, as humans are also some of the most valuable commodities in the galaxy. Solar systems might be sold for less. Among those who cared for the history of the galaxy, we were near priceless. the desolate and lost children of the most powerful race to ever rule the stars. Of the number that remained in my day, most were slaves kept as playthings. Others were put in temporal fields for various menageries and museums. And then there was always the dissection table. But what was orders of magnitude more rare than a human, something now thought practically extinct in my race, was a human child. It was very possible I was the last one in the galaxy because while our lifespans are inordinately long, the window for which we can reproduce is only during the first 2 centuries of our lives. As we approached the water world of Niad, Amon had a tracker put in me. He gave Ingrish a plasma pistol, something she would now always carry, and gave explicit instructions many times that if we were to disembark, we would stick to the highest terraces of the massive habitation towers that overlooked the endless waves. I would have been forced to stay on the ship entirely, but that itself was a danger. Over the centuries, Amon had to deal with many break-ins because someone noticed the Aphelion was a human vessel. Of course, these occurrences became rarer and rarer over the years as our race dwindled. By my day, it was likely that no one would so much as raise an eye at us. For most aliens, humans were that distant species of the past, the first ones to cross the stars, but now nothing more. It was likely most wouldn't even recognize me as being a human, instead thinking I belonged to some other obscure race. I don't think any other species can comprehend what it's like. Every room on every world is indifferent to us. No matter where we go, there are no familiar faces. There is no place that is warm or comely to us. We are strangers wherever we go, and every language to us is a foreign one. While we can make friends with aliens, and sometimes those bonds could be strong enough to be called family, there is no one who can understand. There is no one who is like us. To be a human is to be utterly and totally alone. The reason Amon cried was because he thought his decision to board the derelict vessel nearly got me killed, and then he would have been alone again. Ingrish took me to the viewport as we made our landing. True as I had seen, it was as beautiful as Ingrish had shown me. That was a concept that took me a long time to fully understand. We often think of beauty as a scale, when we say such and such is beautiful or ugly, as if it's an attribute separate and distinct from the object itself, when it is in fact intrinsic. Beauty is not something we assign to such and such. It leaps out at you, perhaps more real than the objects with which we describe. But that category had not existed for me. What was in front of me was simply what was. It required no further contemplation. Most would have called Giza 6 horrifyingly ugly. But I had neither reference nor was taught to think in such terms, and so Giza 6 was neither ugly to me nor beautiful. It simply was. There was nothing in my world that ought to be pondered or appreciated for its aesthetic. I didn't even know the word. It is easy to communicate that I had no knowledge of art. It is a harder thing to understand that I had no sense of it. There was a time when you could have shown me a painting, and not only would I not grasp its meaning, I would not have been able to even fathom its purpose. But seeing Niad, it wasn't just a new world. It was a new world. The crystal blue oceans which spanned its vast surface was a color I hadn't seen before. The massive habitation towers, like hulking steeples, rose frighteningly high over the waves. They spanned vast networks that were easily seen from orbit. I saw clouds, real clouds, not the smoggy haze of Giza 6. The color was unnatural to my eyes, as if you were to stick your hand in fire. And yet I couldn't look away. This world was a sapphire jewel with white foam. Its sight opened a new longing in me. It was something I realized I had been deprived of. I wondered why Giza 6 was not like this, and what if I had lived here instead of with a Mansa? I suddenly had a strange thought, perhaps naive among those who are old enough to lose common sense. Why did we allow so many things to be ugly? Why was the whole universe not beautiful like this? The cold night of space began to brighten as the Aphelion descended. We joined a long traffic line of ships heading for a spaceport. I gawked at the many different kinds and shapes of ships just as much as the world itself. Some were long trams carrying hundreds of aliens throughout the solar system. Some were large cargo freighters with big boxy holds. Some were mobile agri-houses with domed modules for growing vegetation. Some were patrol ships, scanning and clearing vessels as they went. And some were strange. I saw one that had a spherical bridge that elongated into a thin neck with 2 large engines attached at the end. My eyes could not keep up with them all. Instead of the desolate pads like in Giza 6, the spaceport on Niad was like a flower nestled at the top of the habitation tower. Great petals of steel curved around each other, leaving narrow and wider gaps for ships to enter and exit. Crisscrossing the interior of these petals were creases meant as individual landing pads. Each ship was given its own nook to rest in accordance with its size. It seemed the smaller ships stuck to the outside and the periphery. Meanwhile, large ships were given dedicated traffic lines right to the center of the spaceport. The Aphelion took a berth somewhere in the middle. We arrived in a small hangar-like space that perfectly accommodated our vessel. I felt the ship make 3 great clunks as braces extended to lock the vessel in place. We had touched down. I ran for the airlock, forcing English to keep up with me. Although, I confess, I was not running towards the miracle world that was Niad. I was running away from English, guarding my mind as closely as I could. For the first time in my life, I felt the fear of holding a secret, and hoped against all hope that she had not pierced the reason she had so nearly died. I had hoped she had not seen that part of myself that I now hid like a shameful mark. Of course, English, being as perceptive as she was, would have known the second from my outburst in the mess hall. I caught up with Amon as he was punching in the door controls. He and Riker had unloaded the prisoner from the stasis bay. The scaly alien was still in the pod, now floating on hover jets. The aperture opened, and as the air of a new world cycled into the ship, we saw an alien patiently waiting for us down below on the landing dock. English protectively pulled me close as Amon strode out to deliver his prisoner. Chapter 8. Niad. I did not realize at the time that the alien who met us at the landing pad, Maya, was the same kind of species as Kybit, despite the two sharing similar plasteel bodies. The Necomata are a strange kind of alien. They were genetically uplifted from sea sponges by the Dalphaean. Their actual forms are little more than long bundles of neural tissue, but this allows them to be fully integrated into malleable constructs. They are then sold as indentured servants across the spiral arm, given contracts of usually 50 to 75 years before they gain their provisional freedom. Maya was patterned after an artistic hybrid between a Dalphaean and a human. She had no nose to speak of, instead only having 2 artificial slits that drew no breath. Her hair was a bundle of cables tied back into a short braid, accentuated by metallic finned ears. 2 blank silver orbs watched us from a round porcelain face. Though some Necomata are designed to wear dresses and what can pass as clothes for other alien species, most were like Maya, rather skeletal, with wires and tubes expertly woven to look like exposed muscle tissue. I am informed it is Dalphaean humor to provoke the eye with both beauty and disgust at once. In that sense, Kybit was unlike her distant sister, as Amon had ordered her with a white jumpsuit. Amon approached the silver Necomata with Riker pushing the stasis pod behind. They walked down the boarding ramp and across the landing pad to meet the new alien. Maya nodded her head at the bounty hunter.
Adjudicator Lairad sends his piece.
Her hollow feminine voice rang with a trill. Amon stiffened.
Lairad? What happened to Faya?
Suffragan Faya was convicted of corruption 2 years ago. He has been recycled and his gene lineage put under supervision. His contracts were taken over by the Excellency Lairad.
Although we were a distance away, English could translate even the slightest movements in Amon's frame. I would have never noticed the curling of his hand into a fist or how his towering figure was suddenly another few centimeters taller. In Amon, I would come to associate those slight changes with the death of a close friend.
That's not true. I worked with Faya for 20 years.
A wry smile tugged at Maya's porcelain mouth.
It is not for me to comment on the pronouncements of the water courts.
It was clear Amon didn't want to leave it at that, but there was no helping it. He raised an arm towards the stasis pod, and Maya stepped over and peered through the frosted glass, inspecting the prize. She ran her delicate fingers along the pod as lights blinked at her fingertips. She stopped at the stump that had been the alien's leg.
The contract was to bring Jorah back unharmed.
Tough. Grow him a new leg. Amon crossed his arms. Maya clicked in disappointment.
That will be docked from your pay.
She circled around the pod, taking further readings before going round to Amon again.
The adjudicator thanks you for the return of the artisan. Here is your payment.
The fingertips of the Nekomata opened, revealing tiny projectors. A blue holographic screen appeared in front of Maya with the specifications of the pay. Amon took a moment to read through it, and then he scowled.
This is less than half of what I was promised.
After Suffragan Vea was convicted, his contracts were re-evaluated by the adjudicator. The one for your bounty was downgraded to a Class 2, lower priority.
The bounty hunter slammed his gauntleted hand on the stasis pod. The force made the capsule wobble in the air as Amon pushed it away from Maya.
I don't get my payment in full. You don't get your torturer back.
I flinched as English translated that word. She had been translating automatically, and just as Amon spoke that word, her mind snapped shut the connection. However, it was too late, and I understood at once this alien was a trained professional whose sole purpose was to dispense pain. I looked at English questioningly, but for the first time, English refused to answer. I glanced back at the pod, at the alien who had unknowingly set everything in motion. I confess, I occasionally wondered of the creature's story, but I had never imagined something like this. The very idea of a being whose purpose was to inflict suffering was unthinkable for the Mansa, equally as it was unthinkable for me. Maya tilted her head, a slim motion.
If you refuse to hand over the prisoner, then you would be harboring a fugitive under Dalphaean law. Shall I call the patrols?
Amon barked a laugh in her face.
Call them. I'll say you're trying to cheat me out of my pay, and then I'll take my case to the water courts.
Maya smirked. She reached back to her webbed ears and clicked the lights off.
Fully off the record. It would be in your best interest not to make an enemy of an adjudicator. Do you think the other gene lineages will be sympathetic to an alien? On this world you are no one. You will either take your payment from Layrad, or he will fall upon you with the full wrath of the law. You will be dragged through the courts, and we will take everything from you. Accept your payment and leave.
The bounty hunter snorted.
Your adjudicator Layrad is sloppy. That, or he sent an exceedingly stupid Nekomata. Either way, you didn't check who was delivering Fea's prisoner.
Maya looked amused.
On nearly any other world you might have been right, but that's why I do business here. You're connected to the UFO web on this planet. Cross-reference the name Amon Russ.
Maya shook her head, clicking the lights at her ears back on.
I have your transactions with Fea, and...
Now check the species.
Maya gave a haughty smile, but then suddenly froze. Her eyes slowly widened in abject horror, glancing up and down at Amon Russ, and then surprisingly, to me. Before I could understand what happened, Maya had thrown herself to the ground, practically kissing Amon's feet and crying out a single word. English translated it for me, though I could scarcely keep up with all the images and meanings attached to the word. At once it was both creator, king, and priest, though those words seemed to pale in comparison with the reverence Maya exclaimed. However, as simple as I was, I only understood the most basic and rough translation of the word that Maya had cried out. As I write from a battle cruiser many centuries later, here is the word I perceived as I stood on the airlock, looking down at the humbled Nekomata.
Ancestors!
Looking back, it was humorous that the Nekomata emissary had not recognized the Holy of Holies in Dalphaean culture, though this was not entirely surprising. The Nekomata do not have memories like we do. Their neural tissue, limited by their origin, can only process the moment they exist in. For them, nothing of their past or future or even memory really exists. As a substitute, they rely on highly advanced heuristic programs to supply them all the information they need for the current moment. Their bodies store complex algorithms for their day-to-day needs, and they rely on the planetary UFO webs for the rest. But unlike us individuals, who bring the totality of ourselves into every activity we do, the Nekomata do not. The Nekomata do not dream or pine, or can even truly be said to be lost in thought. They exist in the moment, and if you do not exist with them, you do not exist at all. For Maya, she could not perceive us as human because the heuristics she would have identified us with were so long out of use that we were no longer human. It was only after 1,000 apologies and a personal invitation from Adjudicator Layrad himself that Amon Russ left Maya on the landing pad. Riker and Kybert stayed back with the Aphelion while Ingrish and I followed Amon on a hover tram. Ingrish had hesitated, but Amon was quite clear we were both to come along. For myself, I was far less concerned with the reasons behind Amon's decisions, and more to do with the new ship we were boarding. The curved, wavy vessel had the surface of the smoothest of mirrors. There were no abrasions or crease in the hull save for 4 slits that concealed engine thrusters. The doors crested open, revealing a circular lounge with long seats and windows that were in actuality holoscreens indistinguishable from the real thing. Amon appeared positively out of place in this comfortable world, wearing his rough and worn Evo suit, looking like he had seen 1,000 battles. Ingrish looked equally unhappy, though for different reasons. She kept glancing at the holoscreens, reaching out and feeling them with her fingers. And I was stupefied, practically dragged along by Ingrish. In my later years, I've known some children to crawl over every surface and explore every nook and cranny, but for my own childhood, I had that sense beaten out of me long ago. On those occasions where I got into trouble, I had only myself to rely upon. And of those times when a child endangers himself, as human children often did, I had the scars, for no one had been there to rescue me. Ingrish had done her best to heal the chemical burns on my arms and legs from the time I had tripped and fallen into a coolant river. However, there remains a patch of flesh on my left arm that stubbornly refused to take to the skin grafts. The jagged, misfolded scar along my forearm forever remains a reminder of the consequences of carelessness. And so, I was the kind of child who waited and I watched everything. Even now, I could tell you the number of decorative struts bracing the ceiling at the center of the lounge. There were 8. I counted the number of seams on the cushions. I noted the diamond patterns etched into the polyester rug. On the ceiling were 16 bulbous lights, emitting a soft orange glow. And what positively did not escape my notice was that the holoscreens were just so slightly offset from each other, leaving a fraction of a hair's length of black where one could peer behind them. A flaw in the otherwise perfect vessel. I saw a lens behind one, though I noted nothing of it. The projections showed us taking off from the landing pad and joining a traffic lane. We slowly journeyed over the habitation towers before, to my utter amazement, plunging towards the water. I reached out instinctively to Ingrish's hand as we plunged into waves. But instead of water filling the compartments and drowning us, I saw the deep blue of Niad's oceans on the holoscreens. The cyan waters turned dark the further down we went. But just before all light from the surface was extinguished, I saw structures emerge in the deep. Many were built off the sides of the habitation towers, extending from the cliffs of steel and faint light. I'm told it is with many societies that the higher classes ascend to the top of their worlds, touching the sky. But it is with the Dalphaean that the higher classes are lower and lower in the waters. So too did these blocky and mass-produced levels give way to delicacy and art. The steel turns to glass, and at the lowest parts of the seafloor, I saw great domes of translucent material, edified with shining bronze and gold.
I want to make something clear,
Amon suddenly said to Ingrish.
In the event you get separated from me, you demand to be taken back to the Aphelion. Don't say another word, just demand you are to be taken back. If they try to offer you gifts, refuse. You will not be safe until you are aboard the vessel again.
I don't understand,
I said. Amon looked at Ingrish with a grim expression.
Translate.
Turning to me, he looked me square in the eye.
I brought you along because I want you to understand what we once were. Who we once were to the galaxy. But the Dalphaean are not our friends. Do not trust anyone who is not me, Ingrish, Riker, or Kybert.
I was actually trying to ask what a gift was as I was confused by Ingrish's translation. An exchange where value was traded one way made no sense to me,
though I nodded at Amon's explanation and simply resolved not to speak to anyone. Ingrish was less happy.
Did we have to bring him along? He's barely gotten used to the Aphelion. This can't be good for him.
Amon was silent, and something passed between him and Ingrish that they did not share with me until after we left Niad. This ship might be bugged, Amon told her as she telepathically communicated with his mind. Voss is here because I needed an excuse to bring you along. I want you to read Leyrad's thoughts. If this adjudicator is behind Feya's death, I'm going to kill him. Amon didn't believe he was putting me in any danger. The Dalphaean would have never opened fire or taken revenge on me or Ingrish. The worst that would have probably happened is that we would have been detained for questioning and then promptly escorted back to our vessel. Such was their reverence for my race. What Amon gambled was what the man had always gambled, himself. That was simply the way he was. Always ready to throw his life away for this and that. The man didn't have a chip on his shoulder. He had a score to settle with the universe, and never once did he pass up the opportunity. The doors crested open again, and two Necomata, of different design than Maya, flanked the opening into the circular glass gangway leading into the main dome. These ones had no faces. Their sloping helmets only had 3 vertical slits to denote a mouth. They were bulky and armored, and they carried mirrored bolt throwers in their gloves. I saw them quickly block the way as they saw Ingrish, but Amon quickly explained that she was only there for me. And he also told them of my unique circumstances. Despite this, however, it took an invisible command from Leyrad himself before she was allowed to pass. If the Necomata were humbled around Amon, they seemed downright astonished at my presence, bowing even more deeply as I passed them by. To say it disturbed me was an understatement. While I understood hierarchy, I had no notion of how to act in my new elevated position. Once again, I found I was wishing I was a slave, and I tried to make the submit position the Mansa had taught me. Anything I could do for familiarity again. Ingrish stopped me just as I bowed halfway down. We were escorted to a glass and bronze dome. Before entering, Amon observed protocol, unbuckling his pistol holster and setting the weapon aside on a tray held by another Necomata. We were ushered into a great space that was... I do not know if my species has the proper word for it. I have visited many places that could be called aquariums, but I do not know the word for the inverse, for when aquatic species create habitats for the terrestrial. All around us was a gigantic glass tank that we peered into. Or rather, we were the tank, and it was the Dalphaean who observed us. There were no walls in here, nothing save for the rounded glass, and behind the crystal water. Bulbous lights hung in the murky depth, casting a greenish glow everywhere. The place was a maze of corridors and platforms, raised spaces for eating and resting and conversation. But I felt distinctly uncomfortable here, as though there was no place for privacy, no place that was kept secret from the eyes doubtlessly watching in the water. Amon strode forward to the central platform, a bowl of precious air that was too small to be called spacious. I glanced around, looking for the Dalphaean, although I did not see any of the creatures. We appeared utterly alone, save for the Necomata guarding the entrance. The room was silent, and I was struck by how utterly insular everything was. From the highest peak of the habitation towers to the lowest depths of the ocean, I suddenly found it strange that I had not seen one of these creatures, not even in passing. It was perplexing, as one could find millions of Mansa on Giza 6. One needed only to land on the surface. And yet, here, one had to descend to the utter depths of the ocean to finally meet with the elusive Dalphaean. True, I knew they were aquatic creatures, but here we were, beings of land and air walking in the sea. It was strange to me that the Dalphaean had not simply chosen to cross from the sea into the land and air. But I did not have to wait for much longer. I saw a shape emerge in the greenish water. A gray, tattered thing drifted to the glass in front of where Amon stood. Before I could make out any more detail, the glass hummed and a frosted screen winked on in front of the singular Dalphaean. I stretched my neck to peer behind, but the screen extended, preventing me from a better view.
Your presence blesses us, ancestors,
A fine, silky voice greeted. Us? I looked up at Ingrish in confusion over translation, but she was not looking at me.
Her eyes quickly darted around in fear, and following her gaze, I could just make out the faintest of shapes in the water. There were dozens of them, all watching silently. I knew then that this strange place was a water court. Amon didn't say a word back to the Dalphaean who had approached him. He calmly glanced back towards Ingrish, and unbeknownst to me, he had his hand ready to draw the second pistol concealed within his Evo suit. Chapter 9. The Water Court. A long moment passed. I did not know the reason for the sudden tension I felt in the room. As I have said before, while I lacked the subtleties of speech, I could observe well enough. And not knowing a thing about Dalphaean custom or Amon's usual mannerisms, I knew something was not right. Once again I cursed my ignorance. It was not that I was oblivious. That might have been a blessing. It was that I was never privy to the one or two details that were essential to understand what was going on. I glanced up at Ingrish expectantly, hoping for answers. Instead, I saw her slowly shake her head. And then, pointing at the single Dalphaean who had drawn near, the one floating next to Amon, she announced clearly to the room,
"That is not Adjudicator Layrad."
Another moment of frustrating silence passed, and had it not been for Ingrish's iron grip on my shoulder, I would have interrupted with another of my endless questions. Instead, with her fingers digging into my skin, I was wise enough to remain quiet. The beguiling voice of Adjudicator Layrad spoke again.
"Most honored one, you brought a bouquet into my court. Did you not think I might take a few precautions? There are few things more precious than the contents of one's mind."
The bouquet is for the child, as I explained to your Necomata.
Amon's gruff voice sounded like gravel.
I needed a translator for the boy. I apologize if you took offense.
The old man's eyes searched the distant gray figures in the water, trying to figure out which one the disembodied voice came from.
"And the pistol hidden in your Evo suits?"
I knew not if the Dalphaean could roll their eyes, or even if they had eyes, but Ingrish perfectly captured the sarcastic inflection anyway. Amon froze and grew quiet, and finally he gave up the game.
The pistol was for breaking the glass. That was not how I was going to kill you.
Ingrish hesitated to translate that final part, but when she finally relented, my eyes widened at Amon's words. At last the elusive detail fell in place, far long after I could have done anything about the situation. And even after it was over, I found myself wishing, as all the powerless do, that I could have said something, done something. Instead, I felt as petrified things kept careening towards disaster, though I knew neither the reason nor a way out. And in the moment, it was that fear that paralyzed me even when I wanted to beg Ingrish to understand why. There was a terse laughter in the room.
"While I honor the ground upon which you walk, you must forgive me if I do it from a distance."
Amon's eyes kept searching among the gray figures, hunting after an impossible target.
I don't see a scanner anywhere. How did you know?
"Unlike our Necomata servants, we are entirely capable of higher-order thinking. But you should know this. We are your firstborn."
The last note rang with a touch of disappointment and anger, the same as a child bitter but not surprised by the betrayal of his father.
"Did you really think you could walk into my own court and kill me?"
Layrad asked, his voice a playful mockery.
"Did you really think it would be that simple?"
Begging your pardon, Amon responded, but this is not my first time. And if you think you are safe from me, you are wrong. I trust you also looked through my record?
"I did."
Then I shall ask this once. Did you murder Faya or not?
Layrad's voice seemed genuinely shocked.
"And if I did, what would be your cause to kill me? Over such a little thing? You taught my kind that we were slaves. Why would you be so angry over the death of a Dalphaean?"
Finally, at this juncture, I found something I could understand. Though Ingrish did not hide her horror at the Dalphaean's words, I saw something entirely appreciable. Despite the worlds between us, there was a commonality between myself and these unknowable aliens. They thought quite like the Mansa did, with the same eye free from those considerations the rest of the galaxy would call sentiment. But even in this, English translated something for me I didn't understand. In Leyrad's artificial speech, I heard the slightest tremor of anger, as if to be a slave was an insult and not simply what you were.
That is not what we taught you,
Amon growled.
Actions.
Adjudicator Leyrad sighed, and he spoke again before Amon could argue further.
But enough. Since I would rather you not leave an enemy, and since I had nothing to do with Vaya's death, I shall present myself. And when you see I am innocent, would you listen to what I have to say?
if you present yourself.
Leyrad did not respond, and I looked around, wondering which of the distant gray forms would come closer. However, a minute passed and none did. The Dalphaean of the water court waited and watched from the depths, and even the one who swam to Amon remained motionless, floating in the water. It was then that the doors crested open, and the Nekomata escorted a tank that hovered over to us. The glass and bronze sphere was blurred, still preventing me from seeing the true form of the creature inside. All I could discern was a gray body and tattered ribbons of flesh. Amon turned and crossed his arms expectantly, unimpressed by the gesture. English hesitantly let me go. Thumbing her hands and walking over to the tank, the whole room was silent for her unfalsifiable judgment. She peered close, and even though she had a cloth around her eyes, she seemed to study the blurry figure as if there was no impediment to her sight at all. After a few moments, she straightened and looked over to Amon.
He's innocent.
It was not easy for me to adjust to the change in atmosphere, and I mean not only the uncomfortably thin air of the water court. Adjudicator Leyrad seemed entirely cordial and even pleased to be talking to a human. If he held any serious grudge against Amon Russ, it seemed to be forgotten, or at least put aside for now. And while Amon Russ was reserved as always, he seemed completely relaxed entertaining the Dalphaean, and I was even more surprised when he accepted an invitation to a meal. We were set at a long white table. I discovered then that the Dalphaean do not eat as we do, as they are unrestricted by the traditional dimensions of the surface. They take their meals in an upward spiral, each seat raised higher than the last. Although the Dalphaean do not sit, they take stations along winding feeding tubes which glowed with a soft orange light. Along this spiral are a number of spaces for terrestrial beings. As following Dalphaean custom, those lower in the spiral are of higher status, and those higher in the chain are of lower station. As such, the bottom was a lavish dining room decorated with fire coral where the worlds of water and air met. The spaces higher and higher became less and less luxurious, with small air bubbles for terrestrials and less ornate feeding tubes for the Dalphaean. The feast was also separated into 3 segments where those at the lowest station could speak to anyone at the table, whereas the highest could only converse with themselves. English was initially refused a place at all, but upon Amon's demand she was permitted to stand and listen to the conversation. However, she remained completely quiet. In fact, not once did Amon or Leyrad beckon her to speak. And although I had been given a seat near Amon, I felt like another outsider who didn't belong there. While English translated for me, I had no wish to follow the conversation. I just wanted to go home, which I realized, to my utter surprise, now meant my small quarters in the Aphelion. The place I yearned for rest was no longer Giza 6, and it never would be again. But in the meantime, I was distracted by my hunger. For although English had been teaching me to use eating implements, she warned me not to eat as to avoid causing undue attention. I stared at my plate of cooked fish, wondering what was the point then, that I should have to sit here at all. Of the conversation that passed between Amon and Leyrad, much was uninteresting to me. English translated Leyrad's explanation for me, the names and identities of those who were behind Fea's death. Dalphaean society is used to many power struggles, and I cared for absolutely none of the politics. Amon announced that he wanted blood, and Leyrad promised it to him. And as I set these words down now, I realized the anticlimax in this turn of events. As someone who records speech to holoscript, I confess I feel a strange obligation that I ought to give you a resolution which did not historically take place here. There is much in our lives that are like the touch of a story, moments that seem to ring with meaning, glimpses where the author allows his characters to read the dry ink on the page and understand some of the import. And then there are other times where there is no discernible purpose, where the narrative you told yourself sees no conclusion. I do believe that it is because we assume, quite wrongly, that the structure of events are for us and for us alone. We think the galaxy contrives its rules for the individual, whereas in reality it orchestrates a chorus. And we should not be surprised when one part falls silent to allow another to rise. For myself, the story of the torturer Jorah and Fea's killers ended. At least it would not resume for many years. And at once, the story of Leyrad's offer to remake humanity began.
Much has happened in the past 3 years while you were in transit,
Leyrad explained to Amon.
Crustacon scavengers discovered the wreck of an Ark ship in far space. They dated it back to the Fourth Aberrant War. It was orbiting a dying sun. The ship was evidently damaged, and since there was no habitable worlds nearby, the crew attempted to use the star to replenish their dwindling energy reserves. The shields failed just after the exit of the solar dive.
So what took them? The heat or the radiation exposure? Amon asked, toying with his food, looking bored. Ingrish knew better, though. She always knew better.
It's undetermined, and we'll likely never see the answer for sure. You know how the Crusticans are, a small-minded species if there ever was one. They stripped the vessel down to its bones and melted down the rest. The markets briefly saw a bidding war for human technology. Much of it was highly advanced but unimportant to the Delphian. One piece of inventory, however, was worthy of our attention.
What? Amon glanced up at the blurry image of Leyrad.
Breeding arrays, coupled with an independent power supply that contained approximately 10,000 still viable embryos.
Amon suddenly became very quiet. And did you purchase them?
No, they were purchased by a Rhodeshi trading fleet before we even knew about it. As it stands, those embryos are now being put up as top prize for their infamous death games. It's being hosted on their homeworld itself. The Rhodeshi are selling this as the spectacle of the century. They expect the galaxy's deadliest inhabitants to be all making an appearance.
And let me guess, you need me to fight. Amon groaned and set his fork down on the table. I fought the aberrants, yes, but that was when we had functioning corpse armor. All I have now is second-rate scraps. Couldn't even stand to a phase blaster.
It just so happens my lineage has acquired an antique Generation 4 carapace suit. On loan, of course. All it needs is a human to operate it.
Ingrish was less confident with what she understood with the Delphian's words. Instead of any specific meaning, the image she showed was of her people's stories of the Fifth Aberrant War, when humans wore armor that made them invincible. But even as she emphasized the power of these armors, she relayed to me that she knew barely any more than I did.
And let me guess, you also happen to have a zero sword.
Another gene lineage has agreed to offer 2 of the 1,199 still known to the galaxy.
Amon clasped his hands together.
Then it's already decided. The only question is what is going to happen to those embryos.
Restore your race, of course,
Leyrad exclaimed, as if any other answer was out of the question.
Without any of your adjustments? Without your sponsorship?
Leyrad became quiet.
Who else is suited to the task? Do you have the numbers to take care of so many? Would you entrust the fate of your kind to any other species in the galaxy?
Amon hesitated.
I wouldn't.
It is at great personal expense to my gene lineage that we acquired the carapace armor and the zero swords. Promises were made. This is a matter of the collective interest of the Delphian people. I cannot simply renege on these agreements.
How long are the contracts? How long will my kind have to work off this great debt? You hold each generation of the Necomata children in perpetuity, and that's because you made them personally. Will we get a better rate?
This time it was Leyrad who was uncomfortable.
As I said, great personal expense.
How long?
We calculated out the cost of our sponsorship to be a period of 2,000 years Terran standard for your species.
Amon was silent for another moment.
We only held your species under stewardship for 200. Adjudicator Layrad was firm.
For salvation, I would say it is a fair bargain.
Amon Russ's eyes were black with bitterness. I demand no genetic manipulation. Otherwise I cannot accept these terms.
It would only be for eugenic.
No genetic manipulation.
You're asking me to submit my kind to stewardship for our survival.
You would treat us as no better than children, a species still in genetic infancy. Fine. But I want a guarantee that humanity will still be humanity at the end of our repayment. This is non-negotiable. Adjudicator Layrad hesitated.
The other gene lineages will attempt to find another human to wear the armor.
Good luck. I'm sure a species with your resources can find another human. But that armor is scrap in the hands of an untrained individual. All the protection in the galaxy is not going to stop another Zero Sword. You need a veteran of the war. And I dare you to find another one before the games are over.
I will need to make many calls.
Make them. I will be back on the Aphelion. It was at this moment I interrupted with a question, though English had to translate what I was asking.
He wants to know whether humans are honored ones to you or slaves. And if humans are honored among you, why would you want them as slaves?
That was a rough interpretation of my question. I was asking for clarification in the hierarchy, not making any personal insinuation that the Delphian were mistreating humanity. In fact, it did not matter to me what we were, one or the other. It made no difference, though I would have preferred the more familiar of the two. Amon turned to me, shocked, while I blankly looked at the blurry image of the Delphian without any clue of what English added to my question. Layrad turned his blurred face to me.
I was told you were an invalid. My deepest apologies for not including you in the conversation. Your kind would not be slaves. You would remain honored ones, only under our protection, and we would require you only for so long as it takes to make restitution.
English translated my response.
Forgive me, I was raised under the Mansa. I do not know if the word slave has a different meaning for you, but that is the Mansa definition of the word.
An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, and it was very much later that I learned I had just compared the Delphian ascendancy to the Mansa, the lowest of the low of the galaxy. And for this, Layrad had no response. Sensing I had said something wrong, I desperately changed tact. This time English did not have to act as an intermediary.
Why can't I see you? Why do you not want to be seen?
Again, no response, and I noticed that all conversation had fallen silent. The entire spiral all had their eyes upon me. Amon muttered something, and English passed it along.
If he decides to show you, do not react.
Layrad eventually did indeed drop the blurred screen, and I screamed in fear. Thankfully, I do not believe I hurt Amon's chances of securing humanity a better deal. When the Delphian contacted the Aphelion again, saying that they refused Amon's counteroffer, he did not seem angry at me. In fact, all he did was shrug his shoulders, heaving a disappointed sigh. English informed me that the chances had been vanishingly slim that they would have taken Amon's proposal anyway, and all I did was throw things into stark clarity. I confess I felt awful anyway. And especially, I did not wish to remain on Niad any longer. My encounter with the Delphian destroyed any love I might have had for the planet, and although I could still appreciate its beauty, the idea that this could ever be a home, no. I was glad when the Aphelion took off again for its next destination, and as I stood at the viewport watching the blue gem of Niad fall into the distance, all I saw was the face of the Delphian looking back at me. And as I think now, it was not the awful disfigurement nor the rot which caused me to cry out in fear. I was not frightened by the surgical scars or the implants. In fact, with the exception of Tut, I was never perturbed by such things. What horrified me was that the unwanted face that seemed grafted onto disobedient flesh was so similar to mine own. Chapter 10. Sojourn. My life has been spent traveling from planet to planet, and while I have lived for more than 900 years, not 3 decades were spent in any one place.
Leaving Giza 6 opened a new world for me. Leaving Niad closed another one. It began a pattern that I did not know had been set centuries before I was born, at the end of the Fifth Aberrant War. Just as quickly as I saw one planet appear in the viewport, I saw it shrink and vanish to nothing in the eternal void. I have never known any other home to rest my head except for the artificial gravity of the aphelion. Looking back, I do not know the right words to describe this. But it is truly a sobering thing to have spent one's entire life in transit, to always be leaving and never truly arriving. I wish I could say the galaxy was familiar to me, but it was not. I have traveled up and down the spiral arm, and yet I know so little about the worlds I have returned to conquer. I wish I could say I had been a man of the galaxy, but in truth, I am a man of nowhere. The word sojourn describes a person who experiences, for whatever reason, the fact that they cannot stay. The person who cannot lay roots, who will never see a second sunrise, who will never feel the same earth under their feet. And the strangest thing, the most curious thing, is that this word has become equally synonymous with humans who have lived on the same alien worlds for centuries. This record does not have a dedication, for there would be too many precious names to list, and to exclude any of them would be a sin. Instead, let the galaxy remember that my first and final testament is for we who can never leave Sojourn. I do not think I truly understood what love meant until I spent that restless night in the aphelion, aching over the lie that I wanted to tell Ingrish. I wanted to tell her that I had loved her from the beginning, that the incident with the Zurak drone had been a mere accident. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I felt guilty. The worst part of it was that I knew she knew. She was a telepath. There was simply no hiding the fact, as much as I wanted to believe I could conceal otherwise. In fairness to myself, I thought much like an insect did. And honestly, that might have fooled many telepaths of the galaxy. But Ingrish? What most telepaths don't realize is that reading thoughts is only skimming the surface of an ocean. Being privy to a person's monologue is no different than reading an autoholography. The mistake of those who can open the mind is that they believe thoughts are the individual, when in reality, the narratives with which we entertain ourselves are only a reflection into a deeper self. We do not know ourselves the way we think we do. If we did, then we would expect to be the person we think we are. And if we were, then there would have been no reason for the child raised by insects to stand dying of guilt in front of his mother's door. Had I been a Mansa, I would have thought nothing of that day. And since I was nothing other than a human, I would have rather died than tried to pretend any longer. So there I stood, in front of a steel retracting door. I did not know that I had to wave my hand over the door sensor to ring the room. Instead, I knocked on the reinforced metal, the steel muffling my banging. It wasn't until my knuckles had split open that Ingrish heard to answer. For once, she did not wear the headband around her eyes. She had rushed so quickly to the door that she had forgotten it. I suppose I did not know what to expect. The Milky Way, the ancestral name of our galaxy for those unaware, is home to so many horrors. Tut was not the first nor the last I had experienced. As a child, I had come to learn every corner was a dark one, and every secret concealed something terrible. It was to my bafflement then that Ingrish's eyes looked entirely normal. They were alien, yes, greenish color with dark pupils, but there was nothing monstrous, nothing that ought to be hidden, like the Dalphaean's terrible appearance. Ingrish yelped when she saw it was me, holding my bloodied hands in the hall. And averting her gaze, she ushered me into the room and went to collect her headband. Her quarters were very traditional to the Bake people. The space was covered in decorated rugs and cloth, much like a tent. Even the viewport was hidden behind thick layers of patterned tapestry. Though I could make out faces and events depicted in medallion motifs, I knew none of the context. All I knew is that one wall held a number of sewn portraits with illegible names beneath them. Another seems to be the journey of a particular spacecraft, unlike in design from the aphelion, as it traveled from world to world. And another was of Amon Russ, saving a young Bake girl from chains. I was so captivated by the illustrations that I hardly noticed that my nose burned from incense. Nor did I pay much attention to the lit vases which provided an orange glow to the room. Ingrish took my hand and sat me in the living room, which was a number of cushions facing each other. For the blood, she quickly ran to a medical kit and wrapped gauze around my injury. And finally, sitting down, she looked at me concerned.
"What do you want to talk about?"
she asked. I pointed at her headband because I wanted to talk about anything else than what I actually had come here for.
"Why?"
Ingrid shifted uncomfortably on the cushion and glanced away.
"You wouldn't understand."
"Why?"
"Do you know your own eye color?"
Ingrid slowly responded.
"No." "It's speckled amber on deep blue. And I know you never once thought twice about it, even those times you've looked at your own reflection. Don't worry. That's normal for the galaxy. Nearly every alien can tell you the color of their eyes, but not how they look."
"I don't understand." Ingrid took a deep breath.
"In Bake culture, everything is open to my kind. Every secret is available to us, except the kind of secrets we don't think to hide. No one pays attention to their own eyes. No one sees their own eyes except if you look for them. And so that is the only privacy available to Bake. We hide our eyes because that is the only thing we can truly keep to ourselves."
The word caught in my mouth. It was so odd to me, because I could not recall precisely when it became familiar to me. Not Xeno Urtaf, not a numerical designation, but simply I. I realized then that I had become something separated, something other than the group. Of course, as a human, I had always acted and thought like that. There was never a point where I truly inhabited the Mansa way of being. But as I have found, it takes a long time to catch up with the truth. And it was not until this conversation that the realization dawned on me. Just as Ingrid was separated from her own eyes, so was I separated from Ingrid. And with that, all the fear and panic I so desperately tried to dismiss welled up within me again. My thoughts raced in my head. I knew that Ingrid knew, and yet she looked at me as she always did, like she knew nothing of who I really was. Or that she didn't care. It is truly a harrowing thing to confess a secret to a telepath, because even when we're confessing secrets, especially when we're confessing secrets, we like to lie. I felt that urge now, even though logically I shouldn't. The Mansa never taught me to lie, but for some reason it seemed I was a natural liar anyway. But I also wasn't a coward, so I gulped that temptation down and readied myself. I didn't have the words to properly express any of it, so I just poured it out for her to see in my mind. My decision to run away with the drone, the guilt that came after, my silly attempts to redeem myself with the stasis pod, and finally now, hoping against all hope that she would not hate me for it. Ingrid took all this in silence, not so much as moving a muscle. Finally she spoke.
"I forgive you."
The way she said those words. She didn't deny for a moment how badly I had hurt her. But neither was there any resentment or anger. It was just a warm, tired smile. I wish I could say I reacted well. For while I had now received what I wanted, I did not know what forgiveness meant. It was unnerving to me just as much as my heart ached for it anyway. The Mansa have no concept of forgiveness, and equally, I had no understanding either. Any other child would have rushed into their mother's arms. Any other child would have hugged and kissed and cried in relief. Instead, I drew back, running my nails into my arms and staring distantly. Even though I got what I wanted, I could not trap the relief in me and hoard it like some treasure. And although I could leave with those words having been spoken in my head, the more I fell away, the more misery returned.
I don't understand why.
Ingrid was quiet for a moment.
"Because you're my son."
I recoiled at the thought.
Why?
"Because I love Amon, and Amon loves you."
I casted my eyes down.
I don't want to be. I want the hurt to go away.
That was one of the moments I was grateful that Ingrid was a telepath, because she knew that I said those words intending no dislike for her or Amon. Quite the opposite. I no longer wanted to return to the Mansa because I knew there was no putting back what had been lost. There was no escape back into ignorance. But neither did I want this ache that seemed to swallow me whole. It was unbearable to me that I had grown to care for someone. No, that was not it. It was unbearable because I knew I could not be this thing called a son, not in the perfect way she must have wanted. I was afraid because I didn't want to hurt her again, and I knew I would. I felt something wet on my fingers, and I raised my hand, seeing my fingers were tipped with red. My nails had dug so deeply into my skin that they had drawn blood. Ingrid yelped and rushed over, once again trying to dress the wounds, but I threw up my hands and tried to keep her away, frightened. The more Ingrid tried to warmly reassure me, the more sure I knew I wanted to get away. She reached forward with a bandage and I leapt to my feet. Without giving her a chance to communicate another thought, I ran out of the room and into the dim corridors of the Aphelion. Our footsteps echoed in the long, quiet halls. There was the ever-present hum of machinery and the creaking of the old vessel. The lights were dimmed for nighttime. Only low-level floor emitters guided my way. I tried to take a left down a disused corridor, dodging and weaving between empty cargo canisters. I hoped to outpace Ingrid and find some hidden corner to hide in. But she raced after me, and as much as I tried to run, it was not hard for the Bacchae to catch up to the sickly child. Just as I ducked into a dusty access tube, Ingrid rushed inside the small space as well. She threw her arms around me, stopping me in my tracks, and although I tried to resist, she hugged me all the tighter. I squirmed, trying to crawl away into the dark tube. "Let me go!" I cried out.
Please, just stop and listen.
Ingrid yelled back, this time with her actual voice. The pained cry made me freeze, and I knew I had done it again. I had hurt her. I fell quiet and I stopped resisting. I was just so tired, knowing whatever I did would just cause more of that agony I had come to hate. Ingrid held me in her arms. We rested there for a long moment, trying to catch our breaths. She hugged me tighter as she collected her thoughts.
This suffering that you feel, I know it too. But you can't hurt me, not in a way that would change anything.
Why? I asked bitterly.
Because Amon told me you were family, and that's how it is.
I looked blankly into the darkness, and using one of the new words Ingrid taught me, I suddenly found I could voice this emotion that was burning inside me. I don't deserve that.
None of us do.
I'm sorry. My voice cracked with grief.
I forgive you.
Ingrid didn't try to force more warmth and affection because that would have only made me more miserable. Instead, she honestly shared with me the bitterness and heartbreak that she had felt. It was more than I could imagine, though somehow still less than I feared.
We all do this to each other at some point. I wish I could take your guilt away and carry it for you.
She sat up and sat me up. Glancing down, she still had the bandages in hand, and she started wrapping them around the wounds on my arms.
But don't run from that pain. The hurt you feel because you care. That agony means you're not a Mansa. It means you're not alone.
Amon Russ had decided on a detour before he was to go fight in the Radeshi death games. He said he had to meet someone. The Aphelion plotted its course for the local star in Niad's system. The white-yellow disk in the sky stubbornly grew larger while I heard the ceaseless strain of the ship's engines as the old bird struggled to fly. The viewports automatically dimmed as the hours passed, allowing me to look directly into the stellar mass in the distance. The roiling sun grew from a small disk until it took up nearly half the sky, and we were still nowhere close to the surface. And much like the star, the orbiting gravitronic relays were also deceptively massive. At first they seemed like miniature space stations, no bigger as to hold a few vessels, when in reality they were so large that whole fleets were dwarfed by their massive interiors. I felt a distinct sense of panic when the gigantic skeletal cylinders didn't stop growing until it was I who was the speck wandering by these gargantuan structures. The relays are constructed with a massive segmented eye at one end, from which 5 to 7 habitation plates are affixed. These plates form the outer shell of the cylinder, extending outward and rotating to provide the artificial gravity. As I looked from the viewport, I saw specks of light much similar to what I saw from the orbit of Niad, only to realize that the interior surface of these plates housed cities. Entering the cylinder, I saw a circular horizon of skyscrapers and glass domes and tramways engulf the aphelion. Countless traffic lanes of ships crisscrossed the megastructure, with the biggest traveling directly into the eye itself. Much like in Niad, superfreighters and other titanic vessels took the center lanes, whereas smaller vessels passed through nearer to the periphery. In the eye, I saw something strange. Around the edges, ghastly blue light dipped and fell into the other side, revealing another station that should have not been there from the outside. English told me that gravitronic relays use a star's energy to bend gravity and connect with a relay in another star system. Ships can then travel along this network, immensely cutting down transit times. But as the aphelion entered a traffic lane to go through the eye, I felt myself strangely upset. This place was so large, so new. It was like a miniature world unto itself. There were so many people, so many ships, and the city below, no, above. How could this place, this great concourse, not be our destination? Of course, this relay was just another one of billions, if not on the smaller side. Before I even had time to collect my thoughts, the ship entered the event horizon of the eye, and then we were somewhere else. English pulled me away from the viewport by the second or third time we passed through, and over the course of the day, I lost track of how many relays we had gone through. But before I went to sleep that night, I took one last look outside. Below, I saw crystalline spires and glimmering orbs lit by a red sun. I strained my eyes, and I swore I could see beings of glass and light in this spectral city. Like all the others, this relay ended in yet another ringed eye. Like all the others, we passed by as if it were just another stop. I marveled at this strange place built by a stranger people before it was gone too.